Good morning. So lovely to see you all again for another very busy day, the second day of the State of the Union Conference. We have parallel sessions all morning here. Then there'll be an hour and a half lunch in the gardens, and then there'll be shuttle buses taking you downtown to the historic centre of Florence, to the Palazzo Vecchio. A warm welcome again to all those online to the second day here of the State of the Union Conference here in Florence. I saw yesterday a lot of engagement on social, using that hashtag SOU2024, so hopefully you can keep that up again today. But now it is time for our opening panel, our first panel of the day, which is entitled War, Human Rights and Double Standards. This will be moderated by Catherine Fischi, so over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Catherine Fiesolana. I'm the moderator, and I'm a visiting fellow at the Robert Schuman Center. It's really, really good to see all of you here today. We have a fantastic panel, and we are holding a discussion that isn't necessarily an easy discussion, but this is precisely the sort of place where we can pose such questions and have such debates. So I'm very glad that you're all here today to participate in it. We have a great panel to tackle this thorny issue, war, human rights, and double standards. And before I introduce our opening speaker, though, I want to make sure that, that I introduce the rest of the panel simply because I think it's important that beyond their titles, we all know exactly what they bring to this discussion. They bring vast areas of experience and knowledge, and I think it makes for a better discussion if we all know where everyone is coming from. So, in the pink, we have Jan Beagle, who's had a long career in multilateral diplomacy, covering peace and security and development and human rights, and she's currently the Director General of the International Development Law Organization, which is the only global intergovernmental organization exclusively devoted to promoting the rule of law to advance peace and sustainable development. Next to Jan, all the way to my right, we have Pietro Ducci, who is Director General for External Policies of the EU at the European Parliament. For the purposes of today's discussion, it's important to note that he headed the Election Observation Unit of the EP, and from 2015 to 2018, the Directorate for Democracy Support in the European Parliament, therefore encompassing activities such as election observation, but also their follow-up capacity-building activities for parliaments, human rights actions, and mediation. And finally, last but not least, Revital Madar is a Marie Curie Research Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center here, and in the last few years she has worked, amongst other things, on state criminality, security, and the issue of sovereignty in Israel-Palestine. This is our first set of introductions. But now for our opening speaker, Andrzej Szeptycki, who is the Vice Minister for Research and Higher Education for the Republic of Poland. He's a university professor at the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies of the University of Warsaw, and an expert at the Institute Strategies 2050 think tank. He has lectured, amongst other things, amongst other places, in France, Ukraine, and China, and his research interests are foreign policies of Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, post-colonial studies, politics of memory, national and ethnic minorities, and immigration. I think you'll agree that we have a great set of speakers to set us off today. Minister, can I invite you to open the session?
Yes. Dear ladies and gentlemen, first let me tell you how much I'm happy to be here at this conference at the European University Institute in Florence. The topic of this panel is war and human rights. When we think in Poland now about the war, we think about Ukraine. And for this reason, the topic of this introductory speech is why Ukraine matters. Basically, there are two answers to that question. First, community. Second, security. Ukraine is both geographically and culturally a European country. It borders 4 members of the European Union and NATO. It has been for centuries a part of Europe, first as Kiev Rus, then, for example, as a part of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Its culture, religion, traditions are a part of the European heritage. Well, just to give you an example, 1,000 years ago, the daughter of the Kiev great prince, Yaroslav the Wise, married the French king Henry I, becoming the Queen of France. But that's history. Speaking about present times, since 1991, when Ukraine became independent, it has established close ties with the European Union and European states. In 2014, it has signed the association agreement with the European Union. Well, now, since December 2023, it is conducting the accession talks with the EU. It's not only about politics. We have also established close people-to-people contacts with hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who, before the beginning of the war, migrated to European countries as economic migrants, to Poland, Germany, Czech Republic, but also to Italy, to work here and to build our GDPs. Most of all, speaking about community, we have to speak about the community of values. Ukraine is a European democratic country where since 1991 power regularly changed through democratic elections. Lukashenko came to power in Belarus in 1994, much like Kuchma. The problem is Lukashenko is still now the dictator of Belarus, while since 1994, Ukraine had some kind of 4 or 5 presidents for the last 30 years. So first, community. Second, security. When we think about the Ukrainian-Russian war, when we think about the Russian war crimes in Bucha, when we think about the destruction of Mariupol, all this reminds us of the Second World War destruction in Europe. But not only about history. We fear that similar scenes may happen in other European cities, in Tallinn, Riga, Warsaw, or maybe even in Western Europe. Vladimir Putin dreams about rebuilding Soviet Union. He considered the collapse of Soviet Union as the biggest geopolitical tragedy in 20th century. He is dreaming about creating the Russian world, Ruski Mir, to rebuild the Russian zone of influence. Please keep in mind, during the Cold War, the Soviet zone of influence included not only Ukraine or the Baltic states, but also Poland, well, even a part of Germany. Russia is a revisionist great power, a rogue state dreaming about making Russia great again. It has both the political will and the military potential to use force in international relations. We've seen that in Georgia in 2008, we've seen that in Ukraine in 2014, and in 2022. So for these reasons, it is far possible that another war launched by Russia may happen in Europe. And we are more and more aware about that fact. Not only the members of the eastern flank of NATO, who have the experience of being under Moscow domination, but also Western European countries, just like Germany, which for many years tried to establish good, economically beneficial relations with Russia. This is over, even in Germany. So the war in Ukraine is about both values and security. This is the war about democracy because Putin cannot stand that Ukraine, which is considered by some Russians as younger brother of Ukraine, wants to live outside the Ruski Mir, wants to be part of the community of democratic states in Europe. But this war is also about security, our security. If we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he will most probably strike again. Of course, the war in Ukraine is not the only conflict we are following with a great attention currently. For last 20 years, well, even more, we've received in Europe refugees from such countries as Syria, Libya, Afghanistan. Now we are following with a great attention the conflict in Gaza. I think the key point about this panel and also about these conflicts is that they are not easily comparable. In each case, the situation is very different. In case of Ukraine, the situation is very clear. We have a peaceful, democratic country which has been attacked by a post-colonial power which wants to re-establish its zone of influence. In case of Syria, we faced in Europe a wave of refugees who had to flee their country because of the civil war which was launched by the population against a brutal dictatorship. A civil war which later turned into an international conflict because of the involvement of foreign powers. In case of Gaza, situation is even more complex. Israel was established in a great part by the Jews who left Europe after Holocaust. Since 1967, Israel occupies both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. However, this phase of the conflict was launched last year in October by the terrorists from Hamas, who struck Israel, which led in a turn to the war of Israel against Gaza, which led to the progressive destruction of Gaza. I deeply sympathize. I think we all deeply sympathize with all the victims of the Gaza conflict. And we urge both sides to end it as soon as possible. However, for Europe, what counts? This is our existential threat. This is the Russian aggressive revisionism and the war in Ukraine. We have to stand by Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vice Minister. I think this really sets us off on sets the parameters of our discussion. So I'm going to invert my first two speakers, and I'm going to turn directly to you, Refettorio, to follow up on this extremely clear and thought-provoking opening statement, and talk about this issue of comparability of these conflicts, and also this idea that there is something quite specific about Ukraine because of different kinds of proximity, which is something that we hear quite legitimately, in a sense, all the time. Proximity in terms of our security, in terms of values, in terms of democratic framework. And I just wondered if you had some thoughts before I hand over to Pietro.
Thank you. We have a saying in Hebrew, it says, Aniei ircha kodmim, and what it means is that you should prioritize who you're helping according to blood relation first, and then your neighbor, and then the residents of your city, etc., etc., etc. that makes for a very, very bad politics. It means that you prioritize proximity over necessity. And I think that in the context of the European Union and Europe at large, it also disregards Europe's responsibility for many countries that don't share any geographical borders with it due to historical colonialism. It also requires to ask, who does Europe defines as neighbor, as a periphery of Europe, which is a term we hear constantly. Moreover, there is a long-standing history to October 7, and I think that the international community and the European Union should really ask itself where it was for the last 75 years, in which we had the Nakba, the military rule over Palestinians living in Israel, then we had the occupations with a long, long list of violations of human rights and international law, blockage of nearly 20 years of Gaza. All this implies that Palestinians are simply not equal. They don't deserve the life that we can live. And I think that the issue with the comparison really to Europe's reaction to Ukraine, especially around the treatment of refugees and sanctions, I think these are the two main issues, is really that it was not, it was a surprising reaction, but it proved that another politics is possible. And then, unfortunately, October 7 happened, and shortly afterwards, Israel's campaign against Gaza started. And just a reminder, according to the ICJ, it probably amounts to a genocide. And then we saw that all these beautiful gestures and coming together of the international community simply evaporated, and making us think, and us, I mean really people who want to live as equals with Palestinians between the river and the sea, that the application of international law is made only in a very selective manner and not as a principle.
Thank you, thank you. I want to stay on this issue. I want to stay on the specific issue of double standards, and I want to ask you, Pietro Ducci. The European Parliament has contacts and institutional forms of cooperation with counterparts in other parliaments, also with executive powers, with civil society across the world. How much have you witnessed the accusation of double standards in recent months and years? Let's keep looking at this concept.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you very much for inviting me for this panel. It's a great opportunity, and I'm really very honored to be there. You introduced me at the beginning, so I'm a civil servant, and I'm working for members of the European Parliament, and it's in this capacity that I'm addressing the issue, the core of the issue, which is double standards. If I can be a bit provocative at the beginning, I would like to say, to reassure everybody, please don't think that in the morning somebody wakes up in Brussels, in the Brussels bubble, where I come from, and think, okay, what kind of double standard can I invent today? What kind of policy can I work on? Because definitely, if there is something which is true, is that double standards is not a policy of the European Union. Creating this kind of double standard is not something, is not coming from a will from the side of the European Union as such and all the institutions. But of course, I'm not going to be naive and deny the fact that there are double standards, and as Catherine said, very frequently we come across these kind of double standards. We are in contact, first of all, with parliaments, but also with civil society, with human rights group, with the executive, and the issue of double standards, the criticism of double standards, they can be on war, they can be on international agreements, they can be on vaccines, they can be on refugees. It comes and it's part of a discussion. It's part of things which are addressed on a daily basis on how to see how to do them. Of course, there are dramatic situations like the one currently in Gaza, which is, I mean, the paradigm of that. And there is an attempt to try to address them. But very often, if I may, and I conclude with that, there is the tendency to criticize the European Union for that. But the European Union decision-making progress, in particular in external relations, is a very complex one. It's a very complex one. It's a culture of negotiation, discussion, sitting around the table, considering the various options, and at the end, and I'm talking for all the institutions in this case, coming with a negotiated compromise. A compromise is never perfect. A compromise is the result of very difficult and different positions. And in cases like the one we were mentioning, these are there, and it's a fact. So it's a non-perfect democracy, as the President of Portugal was saying today, but it's a fact. And just think a second, again being provocative, what would it be without that? We were not talking, would not talk about double standard. We were talking about double standard in 27 member states. So that's the thing I wanted to address at the beginning. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much. So, Jan, I want to bring you in on this and basically ask the obvious question, I'm afraid, which is that why is this critique of double standards so particularly powerful today?
Well, I think clearly we all know that this is nothing new. Throughout history, there have been double standards, and I think since the founding of the United Nations, diplomats have been accusing each other of having double standards. I think perhaps today it's more powerful because we are, first of all, at a very complex time. We have a series of intersecting global crises, more conflicts than we've had since World War II, global economic crisis, effects of climate change, lingering effects of the pandemic, mass movements of people, and all of this has really, I think, eroded trust among civilians and citizens in institutions, whether they're global or national. We're also in a very polarized world. I mean, when I began my diplomatic career, it was during the Cold War, and clearly it was polarized then, and there were divisions, and there was double standards, but it was much simpler. Now we have a multipolar world, we have China in the mix, we have players from the global south. It's a very different world. And in this world, we also seem to have a sense of impunity. Almost any country or armed group feels that they can take action. And we've got massive violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, actually in all regions of the world. And if we look now, we can look Sudan, the Sahel, Haiti, Myanmar, as well as Ukraine, Gaza, and the West Bank. And then maybe the other thing I would say is that the multilateral system is in crisis. Clearly, Security Council is struggling to find solutions, either to prevent or resolve conflicts, and it's definitely perceived by the countries of the Global South that there are differences of approach, different ways of looking at international law on the part of the countries, or many of the countries of the North, different applications. And I think you can see that in the changes in the United Nations for support for Ukraine. At the outset, after the invasion, there was major support among all the countries, I would say almost all the countries in the United Nations for Ukraine. But if you saw earlier this year in February, when the ministers of the European Union came to New York to commemorate the second anniversary of the invasion, Ukraine did not put forward a resolution in the General Assembly, and I think that was because they probably thought they would not get the same number of votes as they did get a year earlier. And I think the last thing perhaps is that these multilateral institutions we have are outdated. We know that they were formed at a time in 1945, 51 members, 193 members now, so it's not surprising that particularly those from the Global South feel that there are double standards, and that these are not only in the areas of peace and security, but as the other speakers have said, also in areas like climate change or pandemics or other areas where they don't feel that there is the same standard applied to all countries.
Thank you. I mean, I think this sets us up well for a next set of questions. And, you pointed to the fact that there's added complexity and also a multilateral order and a set of multilateral institutions that are having trouble coping with this kind of tectonic shift that we're all undergoing. Some would argue, and here I'll turn first to you, Vice Minister, some would argue that The accusations of double standards are also in this new multilateral disorder being instrumentalized in highly effective ways by powers, for example, such as Russia. I wonder if you would comment on this.
Well, certainly. First, let me remind you that Russia is also very often referring to human rights. I mean, the war in Ukraine, just to give you an example, but there were similar cases with Georgia, Syria, and so on, was launched in particular to prevent the genocide of the Russian-speaking population in the Donbass. Of course, until 2014, people in Donbass lived peacefully and nobody had major problems like Russians in Crimea and so on. Maybe the economic situation was not wonderful, but Ukraine was a relatively poor country, but it was completely peaceful. But this is another example of double standard, which we call the lawfare. Okay? I mean, you can use human rights in good faith or in bad faith. Basically, within the European Union, we not only speak about the human rights, but we also have effective instruments to protect them. Well, the Article 7 of the Treaty on European Union, we have also the European Court of Human Rights in the Council of Europe. Russians don't have that. No, neither the Article 7 nor the Council of Europe at that moment. But at the political level, they use the human rights in bad faith. So using the pretext of human rights being not respected, they launch successively conflicts against their direct neighbors and, in some cases, other countries.
Thank you. Pietro, would you like to come in on this in terms of an EU perspective?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on foreign interference in particular. The Minister mentioned Russia. An image. When we look at news coming from Sahel countries, and you see all these Russian flags, you ask yourself what went wrong, in the sense that until 15 years ago, there was a massive presence, a strong cooperation between Sahel countries and the European Union, and slowly, of course, there is the post-colonial issue with France, fine, but slowly, the European Union has been kicked out, is currently being kicked out, and others are taking the place. Another example, which strikes me these days, is when I see protests in Noumea in New Caledonia, and you see Azerbaijani flag. I mean, this is something which is questionable. I'm not saying that this is not double standard, but the fact that there are some foreign interference manipulating the truth, by the way, by countries who have low records of human rights, as you said, this is something that is very problematic, and the European Parliament has addressed this issue via two special committees on foreign interference and manipulation from third countries. And this is a fact that, according to me, has to become, and by the way, there are political discussions in this moment among the candidates of the new commissioner, that there must be, at the level of the European Union, much more investment on fighting against foreign interference, fighting against disinformation and manipulation, not to solve the problem of double standard, but to address them in a much more clear and positive way.
Revital, I wonder if I could turn to you to comment on this point, because I know it's something you've thought about.
I think that clearly Russia is going to take advantage of the situation. It's a state. States do that in general. States tend to have double standards in general. I think that the fact that we are speaking about the EU's double standards means that we have other expectations from this organization eventually. But I'm really worried about the fact that discussing Russia and its use of disinformation, especially in Africa, currently as the savior of colonized people, really takes us away from what is at stake now, and that's really Palestinian lives. Because I'm sure many of you are aware of that, but for the audience for whom is not aware, It's nearly impossible to take people outside of Gaza. I mean, now the Rafah crossing is closed since the attack on Rafah began. But even prior to it, each Palestinian had to pay thousands of dollars to Egypt. Egypt has its concerns about why it doesn't want to just open the border. But I would expect Europe to say, okay, allow people to get into Egypt, and we will give them visas from that moment on instead of letting them stay, the lucky ones, in this loophole. So I'm really worried about how when we speak about this information, we are risking the possibility that maybe we take away the discussion, and we see it in the last 8 months around different issues. So I'm happy to hear that there are attempts to really tackle the issue, not just to fight disinformation, but to find long-standing solutions. But I think that's the only effective way to go around this campaign of Russia. If Europe will remedy its doing until now.
Well, that's great. That takes us to, I suppose, the what can we do question. We have these expectations, as you said. We would expect the EU to take a particular stance. So, what are the instruments? What can be done? I'm going to turn to you first, Pietro. What are the main instruments in the EU and of the European Parliament in terms of meeting these expectations?
Well, it's not a simple question because, first of all, I can see from the perspective of the European Parliament. First of all, in a way, it's an easy perspective because the European Parliament has always tried to address the issue, to put human rights very high on the agenda, but I'll come with some more specific things on that. First of all, the European Parliament has a role to play in terms of agenda setting. For example, issues are addressed. There is a plenary where resolutions are voted. Everybody looks carefully to this resolution. Sometimes, if I may, more carefully that those who draft them, who vote them, are doing them, in particular in some cases of urgency resolution. So, but this is already one thing, which is very important. The agenda setting, and by the way, being the European Parliament an institution who votes a majority, the European Parliament sometimes is able to express the position, while other bodies are less able to express that. In this sense, I can quote a resolution of 19 October, where, as an institution, the European Parliament said very clearly at the beginning its position on what was going on in Gaza. Then, below the top of the pyramid, there is all the day-by-day work of European Parliament in cooperation, in this case, in participating to legislative or other kind of process with other institutions. For example, when we talk about commercial policy, in all international commercial agreement, the European Parliament, not in an isolated way, but really insists on humanitarian clauses, and sometimes it's very difficult, even between the Parliament, to find compromise on that. Then there is development policy, foreign affairs policies, etc., and everything which is related to human rights. So these are the kind of instruments. There is much more, but I cannot develop all that. There is a parliamentary diplomacy, if you want to talk about European Parliament, but this is a particular thing. I can maybe tell in another moment something more about that. Just one word at the end. What the European Union now should do better in the future, and this is nothing new for anybody, and it goes beyond foreign policy, is the communication on how policies are developed, what is doing. Because how often we find in international framework, when we talk about external policies, but even in internal framework, a lack of understanding and information of how things are done, and this is detrimental to the development of this institution, as you were saying before.
Thank you. And Jan, I'm going to ask you a variation, I guess, on this question. What are the ways in which Europe, but also the international community can respond? What does the rule of law, which in many ways is being, it feels as though it's being quite systematically undermined, and in some places is quite literally under fire, what can it bring?
Well, I think that even in this imperfect international structure that we have, we do have a very serious body of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, beginning with the Charter and then the international conventions and the Geneva Conventions and others. And what we need is implementation of those. And I think that is fundamental. Number one is protection of civilians wherever. And if we're looking at crises, we're talking about some particular ones here, but as I mentioned before, you have many others around the globe where the same human rights violations and massive attacks on civilians are taking place, famine being used as a weapon of war, and other such atrocities happening in all regions. And I think that we really need a greater focus on that. We need leadership. We need, as the elders, Mary Robinson was saying the other day, we need long view leadership that's based on principles and international norms. And the other side of that is I think we need very aware civil society. Yesterday, the two presidents talked about that, and I think that's really important, much more involved civil society that hold leadership to account. We've got to have a much deeper focus on prevention, because most of these crises that are around in the world today are all coming from lack of opportunity, lack of respect for human rights, lack of justice. So the rule of law, as we see it, is absolutely fundamental to not only individual states functioning effectively to good governance and human rights, but it's also fundamental to an international system that is going to help us to find the solution to these crises, because quite frankly, none of these crises are able to be solved by any one country alone, however powerful, or even in any one regional bloc alone, however powerful and however extremely important. And maybe the last thing I will say, speaking from an international point of view, is that I consider that it's extremely important that regional organizations really play a very important part. The European Union obviously is one, but other African Union and others playing an important role together in their regions and cross-regionally, I think is extremely important to ensure that those fundamental principles of the rule of law become more embedded in societies, but also in our international discourse and action.
I'm just going to push you a little bit on this, because while I agree 100% obviously with what you've just said, the question that often comes up here is, how can we do this? How can we embed these principles when in fact it seems as though fewer and fewer states and types of leadership are actually signing up to them as public goods?
They've all signed up to them. I mean, they're all parties to the Charter. The issue is that they're not, or many of them are not fully implementing them. I think that we have obviously a lot of setbacks in the international system, but we also do have some things that I think are important. I think you have seen some important votes in the General Assembly recently. I think you have seen, for example, the fact of after vetoes, the General Assembly, although can't overturn that veto, can discuss it. And I think that these kind of broader discussions about the way in which states work together to solve these problems, because the only way to solve them is to work together. The way that they do work at the regional level, across regionally, and within the United Nations as the broadest framework is extremely important, and we've got to find new ways to do that. And maybe the last thing I would say is that, talking of double standards, one of the major issues also is around the international financial architecture, and that's another area that has to be addressed in order that countries of the global south will feel that there are not double standards in the entire international community.
That's great. Vice Minister, the last word on this part.
I represent the Ministry of Science and Higher Education. So from our point of view, what is of major importance is to having people educated, because this is a way in particular to fight both external disinformation and internal populism. Different types of double standards are easier if people don't know exactly what political leaders are talking about, okay? I mean, this concerns Russian lawfare, this concerns the situation in the Middle East. I'm not saying that truly democratic politicians never rely on double standards. They also do, but it's much easier if people don't know what is really the situation. It's like with some students in the US who are protesting now about Gaza, this issue of having Palestine from the river to the sea, but they don't know exactly which river and which sea. Well, let's start from explaining what is the political geographical situation, and if they want to protest, no problem, but they have to have the basic knowledge, and that's how it would be more difficult to manipulate them.
We have about just under 4 minutes before I open it up to questions, and so I want to quickly conclude on the issue of Europe and the multilateral institutions as a normative system. When there are accusations of double standards, essentially, this calls us out on our normative stance. And so I would ask, what does Europe, what does the multilateral system lose when it is accused like this, and when it is caught out, even if it's accidental, double standards? And I would ask you, Jan, first.
That Europe loses credibility. I think Europe has been for so long the guardian of rights, of freedom, of democracy. And I think that when you have accusations of double standards, it undermines that credibility, and it undermines the credibility not only in the international community, but within the societies themselves. And I totally agree with the Minister that civic education is absolutely essential.
Please.
That civil education is very important. Unfortunately, what we have seen since October 7 is more and more censorship on any discussion on Palestine that doesn't align with Israeli narratives. In this situation, we cannot educate people. We are just asking them to really align with the government standpoint and policy. And I think it's also important to put the suppression of protests for Palestine, for a ceasefire, in really the larger context of democracy in Europe. I've been a resident of France in the last 10 years almost. I've seen time and again how huge is the gap between public opinion and between the government's policy. I've seen how pension reform that is objected by the majority of the French people is passed in the parliament without a vote because the government doesn't have a majority. We have seen how protests are suppressed again and again, every time using more and more violence. And these are really concerning things. I think we cannot really have a discussion. We cannot educate people. I think a lot of time people are educated. I'm not sure you have to know about which river and which sea we are speaking to know that you oppose the killing of civilians and of 35,000 civilians at the moment. I think that these are really details. I'll be happy to educate people and to share information. But eventually what we see now, and we've seen it in the last few months time and again, is that Israel's suppression of freedom of expression is being imported into Europe, where students in universities are not allowed to protest, they are not allowed to have even discussions. I think personally, knowing what's going on currently in Israeli academia and how professors are suspended and students are really not allowed to show any solidarity with Gaza because they are suspended from their schools, we should be really, really concerned about how we import that just in order to, again, exceptionalize Israel. And I'd say just this last sentence, that I think, yeah, it's true that there are a lot of other conflicts, and there are many countries that violate human rights and international law time and again. The issue is that Israel is the only one in regard to which we have to speak as a democracy, in regards to which it has so many Western allies that keep on protecting it and allowing it to keep its conduct with impunity, and that's the core of the issue.
Thank you. I'd like to note in passing that, in this academic institution, we are having these discussions, and everyone is allowed to have them. We are now eating into question time. I was going to ask you, Vice Minister, and you, Pietro, for your reflections on the broader state of democracy in Europe, but I'm hoping we can weave that into the conversation, into the question time. So I'm going to open it up. 2 questions. I know that there are roving mics, and if you would please say who you are when you ask your questions, and I will take a couple of questions at a time before turning to the panel for answers. So the young woman in white.
Thank you. My name is Tasha, and my parents were born in Ukraine. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, they lived their whole life in Russia. And when the war broke out, I was scared to, when people ask me if I'm Ukrainian or Russian, to say where my parents are from, where I'm from. But then when I would express about it, I felt kind of safe in my environment, but still there was this hostility. And I want to ask this question to you not from a point of criticism, but really from a point of expressing sympathy towards a young 20-year-old person who wants hope in this generation. Right now, my parents immigrated to Israel because we're Jewish and they were scared of anti-Semitism. So now I'm living in Israel and the war has started. And I'm traveling all over Europe and I'm scared to death to even talk about my identity or say who I am. And you were talking about suppression of protest, and I think the wars that we're talking about today are no longer wars that are on combat zones, they're wars of narratives. And I believe that it is in the responsibility of our leaders not only to maintain particular narratives, but to also protect the other sides that feel completely unsafe. Anti-Semitism has risen, has doubled since last year, and we believe that it's very important for leadership and democracies to protect rights of marginalized groups that feel unsafe in our environment. So I do think that even though we need to have discussions and we need to have these important topics and conversations, I, as an Israeli citizen, go against my government. We go out to Tel Aviv to protest against the war, to protest against the judicial overhaul. I feel unsafe no matter what my opinions are. Don't you think that some form of inclusion and how you say suppression of narrative is important in order to maintain the safety of other citizens within Europe and other nations?
Thank you. Thank you. There was a question on the other side. Here. Thank you. Then I'll turn back to the panel.
Hello. Hello, good morning. I am from the Court of Florence, Fabrizia Bemer, International Section. I would like to know, it's for the whole panel, it's a war in the war. I would like to know how you consider the human rights of immigrants, because immigrants are a weapon. So I would like to know how you consider that. Lately, now and then, according to the periods, there are states which use them as weapons. And then they enter the European Union, but also for instance, if they are outside European Union, but also speaking, for instance, of my job, there are problems. There are many bureaucratic problems. So how do you see this kind of weapon, and how do you see their rights? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take a third question, the gentleman in the white shirt, and then I'll turn it over to the panel.
Okay, so hi, okay, I just read from the computer, so forgive me. So my question is to Mrs. Madar, and I want to say, and I want to ask, you said that one of the essential elements of democratic society is education and knowledge. And on the other hand, you said that you don't need to know which river is to protest. So do we want citizens who protest without knowing why they are protesting?
Okay, I'm going to turn back to the panel and encourage you to pick the question or the questions that you would like to answer. Pietro, would you like to start? Sorry.
Thank you very much. Wow. Okay, so I have a lot of sympathy for the first question, but actually the answer is in the question. And the answer is yes, definitely. There should be more. It's impossible to think that we live in a society where people don't feel safe to talk about when they come from, that all sides are respected. But this goes very much beyond what we can do in this panel, but this is exactly what society should do. It's impossible to think that in countries of the European Union, there are situations where you cannot express, and anti-Semitism is rising so much. This is something that is definitely terrible, but on the other side, it's also terrible to see how much the situation in Gaza is sometimes not properly well considered for talking at European Union level, for the fact that sometimes looking for these compromises, looking for negotiation, you end up in a situation which is far from being ideal. I fully understand. On the second question, yes, I think that the minister might come on that. When you look at how immigrants are used as a weapon, look at Belarus, look at Russia now, this is dramatically being done like this, and Russia started to do that some years ago, having flights coming to Minsk and sending the people in the border, and Poland has had to react to that. And indeed, it's unbelievable. And again, it's done from a country whose human rights record is terribly low. So what should we do? We should really fight as much as possible against that. And then once they're in their rights, of course, then it's a question of what the European Union can do. I'm in an easy situation because from the European Parliament, all resolution, all political positions are in favor of respect of human rights of the immigrants, etc. But it's really a very difficult issue to tackle.
Minister, I think you were passed the baton.
I mean, both questions, in fact, on the identity. It was rather a statement. I can also just confirm what you've said, that I was very sorry to hear that. But in fact, both questions are somehow related. The basic answer is yes, of course, we have to have everybody respected. And yes, human rights are for everybody, including the immigrants. But sometimes there is the issue of security, and this is a clash. We sometimes cannot efficiently solve to get everybody happy, I mean to fully respect the human rights and to fully protect our security, okay? This is the case of the Polish-Belarusian or Lithuanian-Latvian-Belarusian border with the immigrants or refugees or pseudo-refugees who are being pushed by the Belarusian KGB, I mean forced or paid to try to cross illegally the border of EU and NATO. Basically, everybody who gets to a territory of another country and asks for international protection has the right to fill an application. And pushbacks are illegal. But what if we come to the situation of a sort of, once again, I mean, lawfare related to these refugees who are being artificially pushed, okay? Once again, what you were saying, basically everybody has the right to be proud of where he or she comes from and not to be afraid of speaking about it. But, for example, we in Poland, we've recently decided we will not be paying scholarships anymore for Russian citizens, with the exception of Russian refugees or people of Polish origins who are Russian citizens, because we feel that in the context of current political situation, in the context of degradation of our relations, also in the context of security, because scholars may be easily used as vectors of foreign narrative. We don't want these people to come to Poland and to be paid from the Polish budget, okay? So once again, we have situations where, unfortunately, it's even not about double standards. I think it's rather a clash of values, freedom versus security.
Yes. Well, I think in a broader international environment, this issue of immigration is probably one of those that is seen by countries of the global south as the area perhaps of very great double standards. I mean, they will see the difference in treatment and reception of migrants and refugees from certain countries. Look, in Europe, certain countries will accept refugees from Ukraine, for example. If we look at situations of Afghanistan, Yemen, many other situations, quite different. So I think that if you look at it from a broader perspective, you have to see that people do not see this really as a human rights-based issue. They see it as something quite different. And I think that, again, there's very few people that are wanting to be a refugee, very few. They are all fleeing from violence, from persecution, maybe from poverty, from extremism, whatever they're fleeing from. Those are also the areas that I think the countries of the North should be looking into more. We should be looking into why. What are the root causes for a lot of these situations? And these situations are different. I take what the minister and others have said in terms of the situation right now in Europe. The situation varies in different places, but everywhere these are human beings. And if we talk about human rights, we should be looking at the value of each human being, and we should be thinking about it from the point of view of that human being. Thank you.
Thank you. Refettorio, there was a question pointed to you, which I'm sure you can handle.
Yeah, for the first question, I'm really sorry your parents had to leave Russia, and I'm really sorry that you are feeling and experiencing a situation where you feel you are not allowed to express your opinion, even though it's probably not an opinion that aligns with mine. I think that if October 7 proved anything, is that Israel's ongoing occupation of Palestinian territories and oppression of Palestinians undermines the security of everyone that lives on this historical territory. And it is really a tragedy to me that we had to get to October 7 and then to the current situation in Gaza in order for the international community to wake up and understand that this situation is not sustainable. It's just not sustainable. And I cannot have me, my family, my friends, and the Palestinians who live in Palestine to have our life undermined for the sake of taking power and control over more and more territories. And regarding really anti-Semitism in Europe, I must say, personally, I've experienced a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe. It was never in relation to Israel-Palestine. It was really a banal in anti-Semitism, where I'm telling someone I'm Jewish, and then immediately they have a joke about Jews and money. That happens so much. It's really, and for me, what it shows is that Europe has never done any work about its anti-Semitism. This is really, first and foremost, a European phenomenon. We see it much less in Muslim countries. My family comes from a Muslim country. We suffered much less anti-Semitism than Jews in Europe. And I think the fact that Europe's solution to the Holocaust was to just create a new colony where all the Jews would go instead of dealing with what led to the Holocaust is part of the problems, is part of the origins of the problems we are coping with today. And as to the second question, there is a difference between a mistake and an error. To not know exactly where is the sea and what river we are speaking about is a mistake. It doesn't necessarily imply that someone doesn't have the capacity to offer an analysis of the situation. I think as really an academic and someone who teaches, I know that students can have the wrong gear and offer a very elaborative analysis of a situation, and some can have all the facts right, all the numbers, all the dates, all the name, and offer zero analysis of the situation. So I think we should keep this in mind.
Okay. I'm going to take another round of questions. I have lots of hands. Gentlemen at the back, if somebody could hand over the... Yes.
Thank you. My name is Tarela McLean-Tibiede. I'm from the School of Transnational Governance, where I'm a policy leader fellow. My question is directed to the minister. In your comments, you talked about the difficulty of security and democracy, and we've also talked a lot about the European values, not just here in this panel, but just across the State of the Union as a whole. So my question goes, how then do you envision aligning or rethinking security with your democratic values in Europe? Must it be a clash, or can we reconcile it?
Thank you. Gentleman in the front here.
Hello, thank you very much for a very interesting panel so far. There seems to be, beyond the many similarities that you mentioned, one more that hasn't been mentioned. I think that in both the conflict in the Ukraine and in Israel and Gaza, there seems to be very little discussion on strategic solutions that can actually end the conflicts and sort of satisfy both sides without one side losing outright. Do you really think that these contracts are so fundamentally intractable that there cannot be a negotiated diplomatic solution in the coming years?
Thank you. Young woman in the fourth row right there.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, you said that, my name is Ariel. I'm from the Rubinstein Center of Constitutional Challenges, and I wanted to ask that you said about Rafiq's closing and Egypt's you suggested the exit to Egypt as one of the solutions, but I'm asking, we have a lot of terrorists that need to get, we're talking about law, and they need to get into trial. How can you divide them, the citizens and the terror attacks? If you're letting everyone go to Egypt and then from there they get support from Europe.
I'm going to turn back to the panel and then we'll have one quick last round. I'm going to let you choose your questions. Who would like to go first? Jan.
On the last question, because I've had a long career in United Nations and other types of diplomacy, and so do I believe that there's a solution for the conflict? I have to believe that. I think that we have seen other intractable problems, or what we thought were intractable. Perhaps the closest I would say is the question of apartheid, where there we had many years, many resolutions, many vetoes, but ultimately through largely, I would say, what happened internally within South Africa, but also international public opinion, moved this forward. I think with the situation with Israel and Gaza also, we've been close, we haven't achieved it. I only hope that in the future we will be able to, but only will happen through a real multilateral pressure and international public opinion.
Thank you.
Yes, well, on security and democracy in Europe, I think that the key answer is the rule of law. I mean, the system of institutions we are having at the national levels or at the EU level, which we've created to avoid arbitrary political decisions, okay, in different areas. And if we have such a clash, very often we have a clash of interests of different countries, different political groups, and so on. And to avoid arbitrary decisions, we have the rule of law. And this is a kind of guarantee. It doesn't work always, okay? But it's the best guarantee we've invented until so far, that one of these values will not be used or misused, okay, for some political purposes. Now, on the negotiated solution, I don't feel an expert on the Middle East, so I will not go into that area. But in case of Russia-Ukraine, well, I mean, first, when you don't know what to do, let's have a look at international law. Here, the international law is very clear. You have Ukraine and its internationally recognized borders in 1991, and these borders recognized also by Russia, by the way, were some years later violated by the Russian Federation, okay, under the name of historical reasons, okay. So do you imagine we are in Italy, okay? So do you imagine one day an Italian leader saying, I want to take part of southern France, or maybe even Spain, because it used to be a part of Roman Empire? It's absurd, okay? So what negotiated solutions are we looking for if international law is very clear on that, okay? We have internationally recognized borders of Ukraine, and this is something we have to come back to. And also, by the way, to send the Russian leaders responsible for war crimes to International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, unless there are more burning answers from the panel, I would like to turn back to take a few questions. Pietro, did you want to interject? Okay.
Because there are questions.
I'll take a couple more questions. The gentleman on the edge of the aisle, right there. Yes, thank you. And then the other gentleman on the edge of the aisle.
Yeah. Hello, and thank you for an interesting discussion. We can see from opinion polls that there's strong support for Europe's engagement to support Russia. However, it's on the street that we see the support for a solution to the situation in Gaza. What do you think is the difference between the fact that we don't see many Europeans on the street to support Ukraine, but they do support Ukraine, but we see people on the street to support a solution to what's going on in Gaza? Yeah, I would like to hear maybe especially the minister and yourself on that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you pass the microphone to the gentleman behind you? We have 3 minutes left, so...
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm British from London, but actually currently living in Israel. My question is simple. It's to Mrs. Madar. You mentioned the 7th of October in Israel happened as a result of years of occupation. My question is, the 7th of October, with Hamas openly murdering and raping Israeli women and murdering 1,200 people, not only Israelis, people from all over the world, and Hamas, in its charter, vowing to destroy the one and only Jewish state, how can you say that it's because of the occupation? Hamas, long before any occupation, openly committed to destroying the state of Israel. So my question is, how do you reconcile between the two things when all across European cities protests are calling for the genocidal destruction of that state of Israel, from the river to the sea? Where is Israel supposed to go?
I'm going to turn it back to the panel, and it's going to be your final word, given where we are. Thank you. Yeah, sure. And then Pietro, yes?
First, about international humanitarian law and the need to differentiate between civilians and combatants. That's an obligation, that's not a choice. If you cannot do it, it's the problem of the fighting power. This is not a selective issue. Second, about October 7. All the atrocities committed on October 7 happened. Unfortunately, history shows again and again and again that when you use violence and when you oppress people, some of them will eventually choose violence. That happens. I am against it. I wish we wouldn't get to this point, but we need to see also how Israel and its allies time and again criminalized anti-violent means of protest and combat against Israel, like the BDS. When you have a definition of anti-Semitism that equalizes anti-Semitism to any critique of Israel, eventually you are taking away the capacity to use non-violent means in order to fight the oppression and the occupation. So we need to also look at that. There is nothing, I don't need to reconcile Hamas crimes. They are terrible, they are obnoxious. So are Israel's crime over the 75 years, even if visually it looked differently, even if the scale at each point was different, and that's really important to remember. And sorry, Catherine, but one last thing. You asked a lot about the capacity to express Zionist opinions. I've been recorded since the moment I've started speaking. I have no idea if you are planning some kind of a campaign in which you'll edit what I've said, like you've done to my PhD supervisor, Professor Nadira Shalhov-Kevorkian. But that's the situation with which pro-Palestinian speakers have to deal with time and again. So that's just to say about freedom of expression that I hope you will respect it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. No, thank you, Revital. I'm going to give you each about 10 seconds.
Sorry if I will be boring, but I'll bring back the discussion on institutional matters. On negotiated solution, a non-negotiated solution, enlargement for Ukraine, accession to Ukraine to European Union, that's a solution. Something which will help solution in the future, and there we are opening a discussion for another panel, switch from unanimity to qualified majority. I cannot develop now, but this is something that would give the credibility to the European Union. There is a lot we can discuss. I'm not sure everybody agrees, but we cannot do it now. But this, for me, will be something that helps finding solution in the future.
Thank you. I can, of course, only agree with the Minister that the rule of law is the answer. However, rule of law based on human rights and rule of law that the people feel is responsive to their needs and is truly people-centered, and that is at the national level, the regional level, and the international level, because as long as people feel that there are double standards, they will not feel the trust that's needed in public institutions in order to make the change. Thank you.
2 points. First, on the protests. Well, 2 years ago, when the war, full-scale war in Ukraine started, there were also protests all around Europe, okay? So it's not like people are protesting in favor of Gaza, they are not protesting in favor of Ukraine. But I think that the difference is, but it's a feeling, not kind of research-based now statement, okay, is that the key difference, and this is about double standards, is that some people, lots of people, may feel compassion for the people of Gaza. But in case of Ukraine, or Ukrainians in Europe, it's not only about compassion, it's about what I was telling about self-identification with the Ukrainians, okay? And this is, I think, a major difference when we think in Europe about Gaza people and Ukrainians. We may feel compassion for both groups. However, the difference is, once again, this identification, feeling a sense of community. And one last statement about international law and the law in general. Well, you've mentioned Nakba more than 70 years ago. Before Nakba, there was the decision of the UN, which was to create something very different, okay? And maybe, I mean, it's historical fiction, but maybe without the 1948 war, the history would be very different, okay? It's more complicated. Certainly it is, but it's for another discussion. We don't have time now.
Thank you very, very much. I'd like to thank the panel. I'd like to thank you. And I'd like to thank the State of the Union. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this place has something special. I've been here for, I don't know, 5th time, and I'll always come back feeling that it enlightened my brain and cuddled my soul. So please enjoy it. I am a bit nostalgic because this is the last time I'm here. Whether we do enough, we need to work in steps. Step number 1 has been accomplished. We are aware that we are under permanent attack, that this is a complex issue, different channels, not only disinformation, but also espionage, hidden manipulations through different channels, hidden lobbying or untransparent lobbying, cyber attacks, and corruption. We saw corruption in the ranks of politicians. It has to be investigated. But we take it seriously, and we started to work in a systematic way to address this systematic threat on the level of the EU, individual member states, but also on the level of NATO and cooperation with NATO and G7. So a lot has been done. Now we will go through the test. I nearly said stress test. but the European elections should be more seen as the festival of European democracy than stress. But we will go through the test. We will see how the campaigns will be influenced by foreign interference, how the results will be affected, how much of AI and manipulative techniques will be used, what will be the impact, and then we have to assess and lay down the new, let's say, strategy, which will, of course, require also more staffing and more money.
What are we seeing so far? We're just a couple of weeks away from the European election. How is this campaign different than, for example, the one 5 years ago in terms of foreign interference, manipulation?
The elections are organized in every individual member state. So those who want to influence the elections, they have to have a special tactics or strategy for each individual member state. There is not much for Europe, pan-European space. What's the difference? Count with me. I was already there before elections 2019. We identified 4 new threats. Already in 2019, I was alerting the member states that to organize the elections is not business as usual anymore. Stealing of private data. Remember Cambridge Analytica. Micro-targeting on the basis of sensitive data. We said we don't want to have it in Europe, so now we prohibited it. I will not go into details. We simply have rules which is prohibiting the micro-targeting for political purposes. Second, cyber attacks. We increased dramatically the investments into the protection of the electoral infrastructure. The third, disinformation. So it remains a problem, but now the difference is that we see something which I call disinformation on steroids, because it started to use the AI for amplification and production. So we probably will not see now so many human beings working in Troll's factory in St. Petersburg. It's probably already something which was replaced by AI, which has big potential to do harm. So it was the third threat, disinformation, which remains now being amplified by AI. And the last thing, the difference between 2019 and now is the lack of rules for political advertising online. In 2019, we lived in an era of innocence. We thought that the political advertising you can see on the billboards, in the streets, or in the newspapers. And now we didn't reflect at all that the campaign shifted to the online sphere. So again, we adopted a regulation which requires the notification when it is political ad, where it is text or image or video which can influence and which has the purpose to influence the voters' preferences, it has to be notified. Like the commercial on the magical cream or fantastic shoes.
And you mentioned in the beginning, after this election, we have to do an assessment, we have to see what can we do more. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen recently launched this idea of a European democracy shield. What do you make of this and how should that work concretely?
It was the accomplishment of step 1, which I spoke about, that we realized that this is a serious problem, which requires much more to be done. So if Ursula will be elected, which I wish, I will have better sleep if Ursula is the next European Commission president. I believe that she will keep this topic very high on the agenda, with a clear plan to have a comprehensive strategy connected with the money. We need money to do proper things. So comprehensive strategy which will cover the European level and the member states level. It is not just a temporary temperature, high temperature which we see or disease. This will stay with us and we have to work on different fronts.
And does that also require a different way of approaching this within the European Commission? Do you need, for example, a specific commissioner that handle this? You have took this on during this mandate, but Does it have to be a commissioner to handle disinformation, to handle foreign interference? How do you see that looking forward?
I will be very envious if the next commission will have the commissioner for the fight against disinformation, but it will be for somebody else to do the job. I think that it will have to be very well thought through, because count with me. Foreign interference and disinformation, something coming from outside, from the hostile enemies. So it's obviously for the external service. It's something endangering security. So now it's for the commissioner dealing with security. It's something which is endangering democracy and elections. Then it's mine, because I'm responsible for protection of values / democracy and elections. And it is something which flies on the lack of education, because in our society, we are not ready to adapt to the new situation in most of the member states. So again, there is part of it in the field of education and culture. It is the matter which is very much connected with the development of digital technologies and AI. Now it's Margaret Vestager and Thierry Breton. You see? And it doesn't mean there should be one strong, omnipotent commissioner or vice president for fight against disinformation, but there will have to be a very well designed cooperation, system of cooperation of all who deal with these concrete aspects relating to disinformation. And this is exactly what I see in our member states. I do the democracy tour. Yesterday I was on my last stop in Paris. I visited physically 12 states in the last 2 months. And again, I spoke to 5 ministers. And they all wanted to do their best to apply efficient measures against disinformation. But in some member states, I saw a lack of coordination. Foreign affairs, home affairs, education, digital, who else? Of course, sometimes the office of the prime minister. Defense, the more you go to the east, the more the defense ministries are dealing with this issue, logically, because the main enemy sits in Kremlin. So again, also on the level of the member states, there might be or should be more coordination. Yesterday in Paris, I spoke to the bosses of the agency Viginum, which was created last year. Interesting plan or endeavor. Maybe it could serve as an inspiration for other member states.
If we look a little bit more at the different threats, you have long been warning about the foreign threats, including the Russian ones. Aren't we sometimes underestimating the homegrown falsehoods regulating domestic speech? How can we handle those, and should we do more on that?
Yes, thank you for saying that, because sometimes we have a tendency, when we have something wrong, some unsuccess, we point to Kremlin or to Facebook, you know. We should look first and foremost on ourselves. Where are the domestic forces? Coming back to Kremlin, of course, Putin cannot speak directly to the ears and brains and hearts of Europeans. He needs domestic proxies. And we see 3 layers. We see a lot of sometimes unknown entities or individuals who do it for political gain or money. Sometimes we even see people who do it just because they love him. I don't understand this motif, but they exist. The second layer in the official political ranks, so we have a lot of political parties now in the parliaments, and we have the tendencies of having some good fine-tuning with Kremlin in some member states' governments. And I think that this is a dangerous trend if we will see more and more of the political parties which will fly on Kremlin's agenda and start winning the elections. That's why I am nervous when I see too much of lying in the campaign, and I want to shout, who is verifying it? Who is catching the politicians while they are lying? Because the people should know the citizens cannot verify. They are just targets of manipulation. And at the same time, by stopping this trend, which requires very demanding political work, we should not forget that we have to do it through better communication, how we communicate with the citizens. When I say we, I am a liberal Democrat, to be clear. As the Commissioner protecting the freedom of speech, of course, I have to be above the ideologies because I have to protect the right to speak to everyone, even those who do not say things which I like. But coming back to communication, and maybe to your first question, whether we have realized what is the nature of the problem and scope of the problem. We have to change the way we communicate and count with appearance of disinformation. We seem still to be again and again surprised, but it's so predictable. We know the narratives, we know the topics. It's always the same thing. Climate change and Green Deal, migration, minorities, war in Ukraine, conflict in Middle East. In France yesterday, country-specific things, Caledonian happenings, Olympic Games, special tendency for anti-Semitism to grow in France. You know, all these topics are so predictable. So I ask why sometimes we don't see sufficient communication from the authorities dealing with these topics in the democratic states. Yeah, and so when I hear that in some member state they nominated a star, somebody influential who will have in his job description fight against disinformation, I am sorry for that person. He cannot manage anything because it has to be, the efficient fight against disinformation has to be built on this horizontal understanding, and the responsible entities, authorities in every member state for the facts in different sectors. So my call is take care of the facts, but not only ministries. I spoke to many NGOs recently about migration and about the protection of children in migration. And I was asking them, I was begging, could you please be more in the information space to tell the stories about the children in migration? Nobody else will do it, because for many politicians this is not anymore a popular topic. You know, so this is what I mean by take care of the facts, deliver the evidence-based truth. If we will resign on that, of course, the disinformers will occupy the space, and not only in Meta. We see the cases of Voice of Europe, for instance, which was disclosed as the kind of media which seems to be from the beginning very reliable, trustworthy, and over time there is more and more of the toxic content. And this is one of the features, that it is gradual, this is not ad hoc, this is nothing which should surprise us.
To wrap up, let me quickly also touch on social media and TikTok. Von der Leyen has not ruled out banning TikTok in the next commission. We have now seen France in New Caledonia, which you already referenced, to ban TikTok for a certain period of time. Is this is this the direction that you're going, do you think, to, for example, ban social media in specific events? And how does that fit with freedom of speech, European values?
Well, first of all, freedom of speech is not the same as freedom of reach, yeah? So when somebody places something online, it doesn't mean that it has to be read as the first thing, yeah? It is more or less technical comment relating to the algorithms. We have a legislation which enables us to do very thorough inspection and control of how the algorithms work, how they fulfill the obligations. We have a right to sanction the big tech. The member states can do the same with smaller tech, under 45 million users in Europe. It is not happening yet. Not all the member states installed the people into the body of the digital services coordinator, so they have to speed up. And the sanctioning is the strongest tool we have as enforcers in hands. You asked about banning. It can be done only by the court. So if the sanction doesn't work, if they do not change, if they do not increase responsible behavior, we can propose to the courts to ban the social media, concrete ones.
The case of France and what just happened there on TikTok, how do you look at that? Is that something that you support? Is that something where there's a blurred line? Of France banning TikTok in New Caledonia for specific events?
That's a special story relating to the national security. And we saw these cases not only now in Caledonia with TikTok, but already in relation to Russia's aggression in Ukraine. We have member states, especially the Baltic Sea countries, which already before invasion started to sanction and ban so-called media born in Russia, financed by Russia, and the angle, the hook is the national security, where the member state can use this competence.
I'm afraid we have to wrap it here, but
I didn't tell you the most important things yet.
But thank you, Mrs. Vice President, for setting the scene. We will now give the floor to the panel to continue discussing this topic. Thank you so
very
much.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. This is the continuation of this interesting dialogue that you had just assisted between Vice President Jourova and Barbara Moons from Politico, and it has already touched one fundamental issue that will be further explored on this panel. The issue here is that with the elections approaching fast, there are fears, legitimate fears, that disinformation as a phenomenon will grow in importance and impact. And there is an area which is not so clear, it's not been sufficiently explored so far, which concerns the connections, the links between a quite well-documented phenomenon of foreign interference, particularly from Russia, as far as the elections are concerned, and domestic actors. When we say domestic actors or proxies, there is a vast variety of entities and individuals that can be considered, from cyber mercenaries to politicians to media. This aspect has been particularly a source of interest for the European Media Information Fund that sponsors this session, and there are several projects, research projects, investigations that are ongoing to better understand this phenomenon. In parallel, the Counter Foreign Interference project, it is really straight on, spot on this issue. And I hope that the panel that it is gathered today will bring new light, will enable us to unblur a bit the lines between domestically grown disinformation and foreign interference. But without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Nadia, who is co-moderating this panel. for explaining a bit the meaning of this project, countering foreign interference in this context.
Very much, Paolo, and good morning from me as well to the audience here, but also online. So my name is Nadia Kowalčíková, and I'm a senior analyst at the EU Institute for Security Studies, but as Paolo also kindly mentioned, I'm also the director of the Countering Foreign Interference project, which is funded by the European Commission Service for Policy Instruments, and we are at the EOSS leading the project, implementing with 3 university partners, including the EUI, so it's such a pleasure to be here today with one of our key partners, but also work very closely with European External Action Service, so it's excellent to have also our both institutional partners on the panel with us today. As Paolo was saying, blurring the lines between foreign interference and local proxies, hopefully we will clarify some of those lines today together, expose some of the things, some of the efforts, but also reflect together how can we address this more effectively in a cooperative, comprehensive manner together in the future. And the project for countering foreign interference is actually indeed trying to enable the EU to address countering of FIMI, foreign information manipulation and interference, in cooperation with other partners, especially also when we look into the outside EU territory, so in common security and defense policy. But we are also trying to forge new partnerships. We are trying to develop tools to be able to strengthen resilience and responses against FIMI, and therefore this project in the upcoming almost 2 years still ongoing, we'll try to also reinforce community of practice to do this with different stakeholders. As we heard, this is a cross-sectorial issue, and this is a growing threat to the European security, democracy, and the values that we are all holding dear. But without further ado, perhaps, I would like to proceed to the conversation with our distinguished panelists today. We will introduce the panelists one by one, so I will start with our colleague and distinguished panelist, Odd Mayo-Kalisz. Welcome today to us. You're Director of Strategic Communication and Foresight at the European External Action Service, and you have also very rich experience being also in the field in Venezuela, in Argentina, but also worked across the institutions. And you're leading very important efforts on indeed not only countering, but even framing the whole debate. Could you please tell us a little bit how the FIMI terminology, foreign information manipulation and interference, came about? And how do we use this now when we try to address the threats in this electoral context, in this year of elections we heard, when it has such a strong impact on democracy potentially? And what are you doing with your team about this?
Thank you very much, Nadia, and very pleased to be here and share this panel today. And yes, probably we do not have all the same level of knowledge of what we mention as FIMI, foreign interference and manipulation of information. So it would be good to start with what has been started, and I'm very happy that one of those who have contributed in the beginning of the work of the EAS is also in the panel in a different capacity now. But back in 2015, we were talking just before the panel, the notion of disinformation and how it would happen was not really clear to anybody. And we started to realize what was happening with the aggression of Russia to Crimea. That's when really we started to see massive manipulation of information, and we started to try to understand. So at the ES, what we did is really a work of understanding what was happening. And that's when we came up with this foreign interference and manipulation of information, which is not judging about content of the disinformation, because we still believe that there is a freedom of expression there, but it is about what is in fact manipulative in essence, and how malign actors are trying to in fact seed distrust, seed chaos in our democracies by manipulating the information environment, by using be it fake accounts, bots. I mean, I think our Vice President Commissioner talking before was really clear about that. And the manipulation is really what we are looking at. And understanding those tactics, techniques, and procedures, as we call them, really helps us to have a common understanding, to be able to really identify what's going on, monitor what's going on, and then design a possible response. So that's why we also developed at the ES a FIMI toolbox, with different strands of work. Some of them are really known. I mean, first of all, the situational awareness. We all need to know what's going on, how it's happening. Then the resilience building. It's about really how we can build the capacity in the society to really be aware and not believe everything that is going around. It is about also how we engage with international partners, with all countries, first in the EU, but also outside the EU, so that this common understanding may be shared and we may act together against it. It's also about putting a cost to this type of action, because as much it is as these behaviors, as we call them, are not illegal in nature, in fact, they have a strategic objective that is not what we think should be taking place. And so the cost on those actors, and that's what we do with sanctions. And you've maybe seen that in the context of the sanction regime against the action of Russia in the war against Ukraine, we've added new media platforms to the sanction regime because they are creating new ones all the time. So there are really different types of action. And then the last one, I would say, is how we do communicate ourselves more proactively. In order, and then the Commissioner also mentioned that, how we in fact can sort of anticipate the manipulation of information taking place. So that's the work we're doing at the EAS, trying not to be too long, but now to just say what is our contribution in the context of the European elections. We work, in fact, we are not in the lead to protect the election. The European Parliament and the European Commission are working on it. We are giving our advice and elements that we see in the information sphere. In fact, what we are trying to do is to both make those incidents that we can see in terms of the manipulation of information available to the EU institutions, to the European Parliament, but also to member states. We have a rapid alert system with EU member states where we share the information so that we can see when some kind of manipulation is taking place in one place, maybe it will be developed in another place. So we can act together on that. We also provide information on the techniques and procedures I was mentioning before. And we have this website and also on social media called EU versus Disinfo that Jacob contributed very strongly to develop at its inspection. We are also going and doing some seminars in member states to explain what's going on and tabletop exercises, and we work with other EU institutions. So we have a role in that sense of support in the EU elections.
Much, and maybe we'll come back to also the more external action, what you do on security, when we discuss further also this aspect. But because Jakob, you were mentioned so often by now, I think it's very natural to come towards you. Indeed, you joined the External Action Service, the Stratcom, in 2015. But since then, you have also advanced your work further on how to address, especially foreign information manipulation, interference, or disinformation coming from hostile actors. And Russia is really your expertise, and today you're Deputy Director of one of the very important programs dealing with this at the Hybrid Center of Excellence in Helsinki, looking at both state and non-state actors' activities that are led and targeting the partners or the institutions, the members of the Center of Excellence. And you have also published several pieces on this front and identified some gaps. What can be still done further? What we maybe still need to know, and therefore better equip ourselves to be more effective in addressing this threat. Could you perhaps touch upon some of these issues from your recent work?
Sure. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thanks once more for having me here. It is a pleasure. Since you know the work I've been doing in Brussels, the EU versus Disinfo, I guess it's no secret that I'm quite a big fan of systematic documentation, systematic monitoring. Once you do this work, this kind of work diligently, patterns start to emerge. You can say who is actually the more regular amplifier of Russian disinformation and who might be just anecdotal. To quote Garry Kasparov, it is possible to arrive independently at the same truth, but it is not possible to arrive independently at the same lie. So if you have 15 different actors around Europe repeating the same lie about Ukrainian Nazis, about massacre in Bucha being staged, there is clearly some level of coordination. But in order to arrive to this conclusion, we really should be doing this documentation of the Russian proxies or proxies of other hostile actors significantly more diligently. And my fear is that because we are not doing that, we are missing quite a lot of crucial information. The reason why I think it is important to document that as well, how does actually the Russian disinformation spill over to our domestic audiences, is precisely because they can be one of the most important, one of the most effective tools. They are spreading the foreign disinformation with completely new legitimacy. Once we had the former Czech president Miloš Zeman spreading the Russian lie that Czech Republic was also responsible for developing Novichok, so maybe it was not the Russians, maybe it was the Czechs who poisoned Skripal. This was a completely new legitimacy for the Russian disinformation campaign. You suddenly have a domestic actor parroting it. These proxies can also help you to reach new audiences. The reach of Russian state-owned channels and even their troll factory might be big, but it's still limited. Once you have a domestic actor parroting their lies, you are penetrating new audiences. So that's another problem of that. And the final problem probably is it gives you another iteration of the same lie. Disinformation does not achieve impact by being spread via one or two channels. Disinformation achieves impact by being spread via multiple channels. The old KGB masters, they likened it to this drop of water falling on a stone. It doesn't make a difference because it's so strong, it makes a difference because it's persistent, because there are thousands and thousands of the drops falling over many years. So it is really great, and I'm very grateful that we have more of these anecdotal exposures just from the beginning of this year, the Portal Combat exposure in France, the Voice of Europe exposed in the Czech Republic, the Doppelganger in Germany. I'm a very big fan of it. I'm thankful for that. We need more of that. But we also need kind of a big picture. We need one body that would be able to make a big picture out of all these pieces of the puzzle. But we don't have it, and my fear is that because of that, the problem is still underestimated. We still don't see the full scope of the threat of disinformation. We would need to expose more. This might not be a job for the governments, actually. This might not be a job for the EAS or for the Visionim. It is no coincidence that both Visionim and the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency and the EAS, all of them have the limitation to tackle only the foreign actors. Tackling the domestic actors is the most politically sensitive topic, and maybe it's not the best to have the governments for that. But okay, then we need to ask who's going to be the actor. Is it going to be the civil society, the media? Sure, but then we really need to give them the resources. When you talk to the actors across Europe, the civil society actors who are involved in this kind of work, they still complain about lack of funding. They still very often say that most of their funding comes from the US or from the UK, not so often from the EU. I find it a bit problematic, so perhaps we need to do a better job supporting them in this work. If we can't do it, and they have to do it, we need probably to try harder to support them. There was this older idea, and I will stop here, mentioned by Peter Pomerantsev and Michael Weiss already back in 2014 in one of the first studies on Russian disinformation called The Menace of Unreality. And they mentioned this idea of Transparency International for Disinformation, having like a big pan-European or pan-Euro-Atlantic NGO that would have the same methodology, like one hub, but would have all these regional offices, and you would give them the same methodology. They would provide you with the same kind of data. You could compare the countries between each other. Where is the problem bigger? Where is the problem smaller? But unfortunately, we still don't have it, even a full decade after this idea was presented. I think there is still this gap that would be really useful to be filled.
Yeah,
you're making my job very enjoyable because you mentioned the two upcoming speakers in a way as well, or even all of them. You mentioned the need for the resources, and we are very happy to have with us Irene Mingas, the head of unit from the Foreign Policy Instrument Service at the European Commission with a rapid response in Europe, Asia, Americas, but you also fund a lot of these activities. You are developing a lot of projects, trying to also connect the dots, connect the efforts, but we'll come back to you a bit later. Before, I'll give word back to Paolo to also speak to other actors trying to address this, not only public sector, but also private sector. Paolo, word to you.
Yeah, thank you. It was interesting what we were saying, Jakob, that there is both a gap in terms of sustainability for whole of society response, so for the involvement of the civil societies in this endeavor. But I think there is also another gap. It's a knowledge gap, and there is this lingering question, this evergreen question about how to get access to the data that can enable to get a better view of what these linkage and connections are behind the screens. And I think to see this point, to dig a bit deeper on these points, we have connected, I hope, a distinguished panelist from Microsoft. So Clint Watts is the leader of the Threat Analysis Center in Microsoft, and in his previous careers had quite done a lot of work in the US intelligence community. He was, if he is connected, I hope he is. Yes, I can see it now on screen. Hi, Clint. I would give the floor to you to pick up on what you have heard now from the side of from Jakob right now, and I would like to ask you how you see from inside a tech company that actually tries to bring its contribution to for a better understanding of these manipulations. What is your take, how you see this fight going on, particularly in a situation of urgency like the one that we are going through right now with the European elections that are coming very close to us? The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here. I wish I could have been there, but unfortunately, plane delays caused me to spend more time in the airport than in the air. But just in terms of perspective on the Russian ecosystem, 10 years ago when I started this work, we were looking at 2 sets of activity. Today, we look at 70. So I think just to point out the scale of it, oftentimes we will hear statements such as, this is a very low-cost effort, or it's not many people that do this. I beg to differ. This is a very large-scale effort that affects all democracies around the world, and everyone in Europe, North America, even other parts of Asia. This is a major effort by the Russians to do influence activity. My team tracks what we call foreign-aligned influence from Russia, Iran, and China. We do a variety of public reports, and I think where I would start is with the upcoming European elections. As was mentioned in the panel as I came on, the outing of Voice of Europe, for example, was a critical thing, something that we had seen for quite some time. What the challenge for the Russians, though, is they want to win through the force of politics rather than the politics of force. And so to do that, ultimately, they need to undermine or elevate different entities in different countries that support their foreign policy position. What's interesting about the European elections is it's many candidates being elected in many different countries and many different languages, which is particularly challenging for them. And so our team, while we've not seen significant amounts of influence activity headed into the election, what we do see, or what we are quite concerned about, is between now and the election day in June, is will there be a more acute information attack, something very deliberate that targets one specific candidate or another. So that's one of the areas that we're focused on very narrowly. And we've been tracking, I think it was, as Jakob had said, Doppelganger, which we call Storm 1099 at Microsoft, and another series of storms which do election interference or election influence activity. And we connect those back to Russia. The EU elections are critical, but I think the other thing to keep an eye on, particularly in Europe, is the Olympics. The Summer Olympics are coming up in Paris. That is a campaign where we have an actor we call Storm 1679, where there's been significant and sustained activity since late last summer. And that combines with Storm 1099, the doppelganger group. We think that is a prelude to understand what we might see in other elections coming up throughout the summer and fall. We just learned that the UK election will be very shortly after. So we're trying to parse out EU elections, the French Olympics, and then the UK election will come right just within a month. One of the key things I think I wanted to note is we focused a lot in public discussions on artificial intelligence. We've not seen it be particularly impactful. And what we have seen be impactful in the case of Doppelganger, the 1099 group, and 1679 is simple manipulations. It's actually the most simple things. Making a fake story or fake image, but putting the trusted label of a news outlet from Europe on top of that. That spreads much, much more quickly, can be much more confusing to voters and constituents in different countries. With that, video is critically important nowadays. If I can say anything about doing this over the last 10 years that is dynamically changed is the access of video by voters, by constituents and citizens of different countries. To be a successful or dynamic influence actor, they need to be using video. We see two groups, one we call Storm 1516, another one we call Storm 1679. Both are using video prolifically, trying to create video prolifically, and then amplify it with other groups of activity like Doppelganger or Storm 1099. So when you put this together, I think the key thing to look for is simple manipulations tend to travel further, and they're the practice techniques of Russian threat groups. Being responsive, being quick, that's what we need to do when the private sector to the public sector or partnerships, bringing this information together so that people can react more quickly. As you just noted on this panel, reacting rapidly and quickly. How do we do that? It's people in this room connecting with each other. It's the public and private sector partnerships. And it's also knowing what we want to say to do fact-checking, rebuttals, that sort of activity. As we see potentially a video come out at the last minute headed into the election. Or maybe we see amplification of a fake story with a real journalist logo or journalist outlet logo on top of it. So that's what we're looking at right now. And then I think that will really what we see in Europe will be what we use to inform our understanding of the US election in November, which is about 6 months away.
Thank you very much, Clint. I'm sure that there will be questions on your very interesting insight. But it's time now to turn to Gianni Riotta, who is a well-known journalist, writer, and academic. Collaboration with the Corriere della Sera, New York Times. You teach at the Lewis University as well as at Princeton. So you have a very long career in this, and you are also engaged on the grounds, right, Gianni, with the IDMO. So I would like to see from you, because detecting, disrupting networks is very important to prevent foreign interference. Infiltrations in our information sphere can come from in many ways, not only through information, but also through direct contact with candidates. For instance, in the resolution from the 25th of April, the European Parliament reveals the existence of corruption, of direct infiltration with candidates to the election. So it's very serious. The situation is very serious. The media has certainly a role to play in this space, and not only a role of debunking, I would say, a role to convey a message that preempts the disinformation from getting grounds on people's beliefs and behaviors. Gianni, what you are taking there?
Paolo. Nadia, thank you all, because there are parallel sessions, so your vote of confidence is very important for us, because you're here and not somewhere else, and so for being with us today. Let me start, Paolo, from last summer, when I was in Ukraine, pretty much where they're fighting now, And I went to the front line, and I was escorted by a young captain of the Ukraine military police. And all of a sudden, the Russians started bombing, and we took like shelter on a small trench. And I was taking notes, and the young gentleman, of course, was very afraid of this old Italian journalist, like what's going to happen to him, now it's going to be my fault. And so all of a sudden he asked me, you know whose fault is this? And I was ready to take notes, but I wasn't interested actually whose fault was it. I would just to get the story and get home safe. And so I expected a little segment of propaganda, and he went, is Jean Baudrillard, the French philosopher. And then I started stopping, taking notes, like, Captain, what do you mean by Jean Baudrillard? And he said, like, you see, because the Russians don't have a set of values or facts. They have a simulacra, as Jean Baudrillard said in his famous conference of simulacra, that you should read if you haven't, but of course you have read it. And so it is impossible for us to set facts and say this is true, this is not true, because then people go online and find simulacra of what they want to believe. And now there are millions of people in Russia, in Europe, in the United States, all over the world, that believe a set of simulacra. And I was, thunderstruck, not bomb-struck by God, but thunderstruck, because that's exactly was the point. And where the media fails, Paolo, and when I criticize the media, all is self-criticism, because I'm an old journalist, both here in the United States, and so whatever criticism I share of the media now, it's my own fault too. Is that, first of all, to fight disinformation, you have to rebuild trust in communities, and journalists are not suited to rebuild trust, because journalists are trained. I went back to my Columbia Journalists reunion last April, and of course campus was occupied, and we were discussing that we are trained of undermining trust. Don't trust the bishop, don't trust the mayor, don't trust the professor, don't trust the doctor, okay? So we are trained in undermining trust. And now the job is to rebuild trust, so we don't know how to do it, number one. And number two, media are trained, and rightly so, up to a point, in objectivity and in fairness, and listening to the two stories. But then what happened, let's keep Gaza, let's keep Ukraine, let's talk about COVID, that is like a little more, a little less controversial. What happened in COVID is that all over Europe, all over the United States, TV, web, newspaper, podcasts, the two sides of the story, meaning trustworthy, serious scientists and crappy blogger from their own garage were given pretty much airtime, because the journalists were trained to listen to the other story. And this didn't work, and this is not working, and the media is in for a great rebuilding of tools, because we have to understand that we are fighting facts, and we have to report facts, but also, as my friend the Captain Kostenko said, we have simulacra all over us, and people go and check their own facts. Give just 30 seconds on disinformation and how media can fight disinformation. There is too much hubris and there is too much arrogance in the way we try to fight disinformation, and we think like, we have the real truth, we have the real facts, and you dumb guys are disinformators, and you are fed disinformation. That doesn't work, because people that share disinformation on COVID, Gaza, Ukraine, they believe that what they are sharing is true, okay? And we are totally undervaluing the build-up of distrust. So there is distrust of West and Europe and democracy on Gaza, on the war in Ukraine, on the European election. And when we got check, we are working with Luis, we are working with Edmo, and Paolo has always been a staunch friend of this. And then when you ask people, but why do you trust, they'll tell you, what about the Twin Towers? And I say, like, what about the Twin Towers? Who destroyed them? The CIA. Oh, are you sure? Yes. So we lost track of that disinformation 20 years ago, and it's still working. Still working. Grazie.
Thank you, Jenny. That is a very passionate insight from within, I would say. And Nadia, maybe you want to take back and going towards a wrap-up with the help of Irene?
I will happily do that. I am having signals here. We also may have questions from the audience. We have concluding remarks. We have so many topics we would like to cover, I trust. So perhaps before indeed we go to questions and then our concluding remarks, just to check with the audience, with our panelists, on this external dimension. You spoke about the war in Ukraine, what happens there, these thunderstorms, instead of hopefully only the bombing, but also the information kind of storms. A lot of these issues were mentioned. Would you like some of us, perhaps from the European Commission or External Action Service, comment on some of these? What are the efforts countering also these security-related issues that we are doing?
I can say a few words to be very, very short. No, but so we consider that FIMI is a security threat to the EU, and we consider that in the context of the elections, but not only, of course. But it's also a security threat outside the EU. First, malign actors are attacking us on the ground of values or double standards or anything else outside the EU. So what is at stake there is a reputational image that we may have outside. And the second part is it's also attacking possibly physically, it's a physical security threat, and especially for the EU, the CSDP missions and operations that we have on the ground. So what we are doing is that we are developing with CFI, especially the project that you're leading, Nadia, a full set of training and guidelines for the CSDP missions to be able to manage this information environment in which they are outside the EU, so that they can anticipate or also react to disinformation FIMI campaigns. So maybe just a word to say that at the ES we've created new task forces also for strategic communication, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where our CSDP missions are even more targeted. And as the topic of the panel is local proxies, maybe interesting also to understand well that there are local proxies for mainly Russian, but also Chinese disinformation in Africa. And especially the Wagner Group, even after supposedly dismantlement, is still there and still very active. And we see the technique, tactics, and procedures that are being used there. So I have a full list of them, but we don't have the time now. But if they are in the question and answers an opportunity, I would comment.
It's great that you have a full list. We need a lot of these efforts, and perhaps, Irene, if you could touch upon some of them in your final remarks, that would be excellent, so we can move to the questions, perhaps, from the audience. Paolo.
The floor is yours now. I don't know whether you have questions for any of the speakers, including Clintwatch, that it is connected with us. Yes, I see the gentleman on the...
Thank you. Thank you very much. Helfried Karl from the European Capital of Democracy. I just wanted to underline the fact that I think we need to be more agile and more innovative in the answers in fighting misinformation, but also in the funding of those answers. We have just conducted a hackathon, a 3-day hackathon in the framework of the European Capital of Democracy, where we challenged the gaming community to come up with new games fighting misinformation and disinformation. And it was extremely difficult to find funds for that. The State Department in the end funded some of this. But I have to say, when we are talking about strategic communication, you cannot wait for long tender processes. And Europe needs to change in this respect. This is what I wanted to convey. Thank you very much.
This is a comment And the question, in a way, I could translate it as a question, starting with the fact that, indeed, we are, as EMIF, supporting a number of projects in this area of gamification for resilience, but we have tender process, and they are not as agile as you'd for sure wish. And what about the Commission?
Well, thank you very much for giving me the floor. Indeed, the Commission on certain topics and in certain circumstances acts very fast, and this is one of them. I work for a service of the European Commission that is called the Service for Foreign Policy Instruments, that works very closely with the diplomatic service of the European Union, specifically to roll out what we call rapid response projects in certain crisis or crisis-related situations, or where the needs of the European foreign policy require activities in the range of mediation or a dialogue, or various types of activities that ultimately seek to feed, stronger alliance building between Europe and its partners. And disinformation, the fight against FIMI, is one such topics. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about that. Why we're doing it is because, and we've seen throughout this panel that clearly what befalls the European Union, what threatens the values, the systems, the information space in Europe needs to be addressed with solid responses here and there. But what we needn't forget is that foreign interference, of course, comes from abroad, but that it also plays out in other information spaces, which are not the information spaces of these hostile, malicious actors, but in partner countries around the world, some of them very close to us, and where this happens actually undermines, of course, our positions, what it is that we're trying to do with these countries, but also fires back against the European Union. And that is, I believe, one of the aspects of the comprehensive response to this very global challenge that we need to take into consideration very seriously. I'll give you one example that I witnessed firsthand because I happened to have been working there at the time in West Africa, in Senegal more particularly, during the COVID pandemic. Now, here's a country in which there is a very long established tradition almost, or at least practice, of very wide-ranging, country-wide and very regular vaccination campaigns against a whole set of life-threatening viruses and diseases. Well, during the COVID pandemic, and just as the vaccines, with the support of the European Union, notably, started to flow into the country, we saw a raising defiance against precisely these vaccines, fueled by disinformation campaigns, which, of course, we had to work against. But what I want to say in that is that that would undermine precisely the objective of the European Union's contribution in that global effort, would undermine the efforts of the country to address in a successful manner this disease, and of course that it would also fuel the established, long problematic anti-Western and anti-European narratives in the countries. So what I would like to underline here is that what happens in the information space of others is not staying there, and that it fires back to us. And this is why the service in which I work, FPI, currently runs no less than 40 rapid response projects in the field of countering FIMI and disinformation. And this around the globe, of course, very much in the close neighborhood of the European Union, but also in Africa, in Asia, in many places. What I would like to share with you today, very briefly, is that we have been able to identify a number of key catalysts for FIMI and disinformation in these countries. The first one comes as no surprise, actually, but is that the environments that are most vulnerable to disinformation are those that are less diverse and less free, and that they are used as springboards for disinformation elsewhere. The second key finding is that actors behind FIMI indeed pursue objectives of undermining and of sapping at the core our values and our democratic context. The third seems obvious, but nevertheless I'll point it out, is that there is a very clear continuum between democracy and security. And that requires that solutions are found within the parameters of free democracy. It is about defending both. We learn a lot, for instance, in FPI from our cooperation with the responsible actors in Moldova and in Ukraine, for instance, where it is about both strengthening the state capacity to defend the information space, but also fostering a healthy environment where freedoms and democracy can thrive. We learn a lot also from our work in many parts of the world that support investigative media organizations and independent journalists. We believe in them very much still, because what is at stake here? It is about the provision and the availability of quality investigative pieces that we then also help transmitting to as many interested customers as possible. Fourth lesson is that there's also a very close relationship between disinformation and conflict, the prevalence and the continuation and the protracted situations of conflict. And this is why, for instance, to cut down on very damaging and violent rhetoric, we supported the first interstate social media dialogue between Armenia and Azerbaijani experts. We also support in many countries in Africa, starting in West Africa, very significantly into conflict-sensitive reporting and media literacy. Last lesson, there's also a very strong economic incentive underpinning this information also in the media industry. Private entities are indeed ready to run campaigns on behalf of state actors. And an interesting work that we're undertaking there is to uncover this huge challenge, is our work with the Global Media Registry to make available a bit more fact-based information about media ownership worldwide. Now, going forward, and I have 3 seconds, I see, this work needs to be sustained. The lessons learned from the various strands of work need to be pulled together for a very comprehensive and collective answer. I'd like to maybe refer back again to the metaphor of the COVID pandemic. This virus at the time knew no borders, was affecting everyone potentially worldwide. It's a bit the same about this information, especially prompted by the means that they have today to reach as many places as possible. There will be only a solution when all of the environments are addressed at the same time, and this is something that we should keep in mind. And somebody before was saying that we also need to put the means where our words go, and that requires very significant investment and money as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. I think we have still 3 minutes for some quick questions for quick answers. Is anybody who would like to hear? Please introduce yourself.
Yes, Sophie Fellbeck. I'm working for the administration of the Austrian Parliament, and I would be interested in hearing from the panel which role you see for national parliaments as institution in fighting disinformation.
Well, this is an open question. I think that who wants to pick it up? Who feels? Jakob.
Let me start while you're thinking. Part of countering disinformation has to be not just trying to collect the data, but trying to raise awareness about the problem, explain to various target audiences what are the disinformers trying to achieve, what are their messages, who are their target audiences. And Parliament could definitely do a lot for their particular target audience, right, for the parliamentarians. They are actually one of the key groups. If I remember correctly, in 2000, 18 or 19, one of the German services, BND or BFV, was even issuing a warning to the members of the Bundestag, be aware of the fact that Russians are now increasingly trying to reach to the members of the parliament because they might be a very important amplifier for the messaging. So the education role that parliament can have for their target audience, I think that might be quite a crucial one. And if I may just touch upon the previous question/comment about the innovative solutions. Yes, please, I'm a very big fan of that, and you would see it in the frontline states very, very often. In Lithuania, the comedian/journalist Andrius Tapinas, who has a show very similar to John Oliver, he's reaching completely different audiences than all of us on the panel, and it's very important that somebody's doing this kind of work for their target audiences. In Ukraine, they have local celebrities, stand-up comedians, gamer communities involved in fighting against Russian disinformation. So yes, we need to accept that governments, media have only a limited audience, and we need other actors for other audiences.
I think
we have to be also aware that in European parliaments every day disinformation is shared, is promoted, is given a pulpito, as we say in Italy. So this is exactly the same kind of criticism at the level against the media. If you think about what happened in London with Brexit, if you see what's going on in Italian parliament, French parliament, Spanish parliament. So it's not that parliaments are like these safe areas where disinformation doesn't touch. Quite the contrary, when disinformation reaches there, it becomes weaponized.
Excellent. I'm afraid we are coming to a close. I think it is the moment to thank these distinguished panelists for these very interesting contributions. And the discussion actually will continue because we have just scratched the surface today, and there is much more work to be done in the future. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 edition of the State of the Union Conference. My name is Elena Calzamiglia, and I am a second-year PhD researcher at the Law Department here at the UI. In my research, I focus on the enforcement of the emerging regulatory frameworks of corporate sustainability obligations. And today, I'm co-moderating this panel with my colleague, Sophie, which will introduce herself.
Which is me. Hello. I'm Sophie Hölscher. I'm a third-year PhD researcher, also at the Law Department. My research focuses on the interaction between international law on climate change and governance, practice, and regulation on climate finance.
I am delighted to introduce you our panel entitled Rethinking Capitalism in Europe in the Path to Sustainability. Today, we will conduct a critical discussion about the most recent measures implemented by the European Union to deliver on the Green Deal. The European Green Deal is the comprehensive plan that has been approved in 2019 by the European Commission, setting out the initiatives the European initiatives to adapt the economic system to a sustainable to the sustainability challenge. The implementing measures adopted so far concerned mainly the enhancement of transparency of the capital markets in order to convey investments towards sustainable business and projects. Today, we can celebrate the approval by the European Council of a very innovative directive, the CSDDD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which will make a step forward and introducing new substantive obligations for companies and directors to take into account the human rights and environmental negative impacts of their business throughout their supply chain. However, the initial project related to this directive was more ambitious than that. as the Commission wanted to implement a more radical reform of the corporate governance system of the largest European companies active in the EU internal market, forcing corporate directors to take into account the sustainability matters in the management of the company, and in particular the human rights, climate, and environmental impacts of the business. Today, we will ask a few important questions that we think that in the light of the polycrisis we are living and that we are also discussing today, and also in the light of the wave that is ongoing from stakeholders that are taking into holding accountable not only states but also corporate directors more and more for the negative impact on the social rights and environmental rights cannot be ignored anymore. And these are these initiatives that the Commission is undertaking effective, or do we need more radical reforms? And what is the role that companies and capital markets should play in the sustainability transition? And the last question is, how are these new initiatives reshaping the relationship between the public and private realms, not only in Europe but also globally, and the power relationship among states? We will discuss these questions with our speakers that I'm happy to introduce you. Each of them is working on their daily life to develop the conversation from different perspectives. Ioannis Kampourakis is assistant professor of law and market at the law school of the Erasmus University of Rotterdam, and his current research focuses on the legal architecture of green capitalism. Then we have Kenneth Ameshi, who is professor of sustainable finance and governance at the UI School of Transnational Governance, and he's a leading scholar of topics related to sustainable finance, especially in the global south, and he also works as a consultant for businesses for dealing with sustainability matters. Then we have Dan Dionys, who is head of unit of company law at the Justice and Consumers at the European Commission, and he has worked closely to the development of the initiatives that I just mentioned before. And then we have Caroline Polsik. Sorry, I don't know, I cannot pronounce it properly, but maybe you can you pronounce it for us? Polsik, thank you. And she's executive director of Politics for Tomorrow, which is an independent initiative active in Germany to foster public innovation in the public sector, mainly through participatory democracy processes. So welcome, everyone. We have prepared a few questions to kick off the discussion, but then we will have time for questions raised by audience, and we very welcome your participation. So I'll leave Sophie the floor for the first question.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction, Elena. So we've already heard that there's been a lot of anticipation and enthusiasm as well about the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. But the text is also much narrower and less ambitious than the original draft proposed by the Commission, by the EU Commission. So, Dan, can you maybe explain a little bit what happened, what might have gone wrong or also right, what were competing interests to be reconciled in this process, and whether you think that the final text can nonetheless, despite being more narrow, lead to a paradigm shift towards an economic system that is not at odds with sustainable futures?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And indeed, an important day today because we just had, about an hour ago, the final adoption of this directive by the Council. So it's now adopted. It will be published in the official journal, will enter into force in the coming weeks. I would say the process, because you asked about the process and what might have gone wrong or right. The process was not atypical for EU legislation. It really went rather smoothly, I would say, especially in the first phase of the negotiations, which were the second half of last year, after the Parliament adopted its negotiation mandate in June. The Council had adopted its own negotiation mandate in December of 22. And then in the space of 6 months, roughly, until mid-December, the co-legislators reached a provisional political agreement. That was after really very fast-paced, intensive negotiations. I would say this was quick, considering the usual timelines of EU legislative process, and also, let's say, the broad implications of this directive, because it touches upon all the sectors of the economy, both in the EU, outside the EU. So really touches many interests and the lives of many people. What followed after that, so after the provisional political agreement of last December, was a bit more, I'll say, choppy waters. Indeed, in the context of somewhat of a change of atmosphere, of political atmosphere in Europe with regard to sustainability initiatives, in the context of the economic difficulties that we're facing, of the geopolitical issues, of the upcoming elections, and that's very important to keep in mind. Indeed, there were farmers in the streets in several European cities, including in Brussels, and some politicians started to, send signals that maybe sustainability is not the top priority right now. We should go back to the basics, to economic growth, to competitiveness. That created a bit of a hostile atmosphere that allowed also some business lobbies who were not particularly warm to this directive to also intensify their messaging. And then at some point, what happened was that in Germany, one of the coalition partners changed their mind, which basically forced Germany to abstain. Moreover, they sent some ministers from that party in the coalition. 2 ministers sent a letter to their counterparts in other member states, sort of urging to put the directive on hold. Again, some business lobbies activated, and some politicians started to make statements. So at some point, some member states also started to have second thoughts, or to think that because now they have increased leverage, they can come with new demands to the table. I have to say the concerns that were expressed were nothing new, and they had been largely addressed during the negotiation process. But politics is sometimes like this. It creates this kind of effect. And therefore, we faced some obstacles in Council at the late stage of adoption, which led to some postponement. But now, indeed, today is the completion of this process. Whether it's, you said, narrower, less ambitious, I would say again, it's normal for EU legislation. The Commission makes a proposal, then the co-legislators negotiate on that basis. They form their own positions. And indeed, arguably, on some aspects, the final result is probably less ambitious, but on others, it actually went beyond what the Commission had initially proposed. So it's nothing exceptional, again, considering the variety of interests that had to be taken into account. And I'd be happy to discuss in more detail what are the differences from the Commission proposal, from the provisional agreement reached last December. But all in all, I would say it's important to say that this remains, what was adopted today, remains a very consequential legislation that potentially has a game-changing effect on how companies do business across the globe, across their value chains. It really can be an important step in aligning, let's say, our economic model to our societal values. Just to recall, it requires companies to tackle negative impacts on human rights and the environment in their operations, in those of their subsidiaries, in their value chains, whether in the EU or outside the EU, to remedy, to prevent, minimize, bring to an end, remedy those effects. There is administrative enforcement for implementing this. There is also civil liability established in case their failure to do due diligence leads to harm. There are also measures to facilitate access to justice by the victims. There is also an obligation to adopt and put into effect a climate transition plan aimed at aligning their business model with the climate neutrality objectives. So all in all, this is a very important legislation, a very important first step. On top of that, I would say it's interesting to know that it also is certainly the most business-friendly and the most SME-friendly due diligence legislation adopted so far. So it includes a number of, I would say, even legislative innovations, to make implementation easier for businesses and also to prevent, let's say, the shifting of burden to smaller companies in their value chains. So from that point of view, indeed, it also brings this novelty, and that brings me to another part of your question. What were the different... Yeah, I'm finishing. Sorry.
Finish your sentence, please.
Maybe just one sentence. This, the perception was that, there was a tension between competitiveness on the one side and this sustainability, basically, due diligence. This is only at the first sight, because actually when you dig deeper, you see that these are not contradictory, and actually embracing sustainability can bring also competitive advantages and is good for business as well. I will stop here for now, but
Thank you, Dan. We will come back for sure on it later. Ioannis, in your research, you explore the legal foundation of capitalism and of private power within that system. Do you think that the CSDD and also other initiatives adopted by the European Union to implement the Green Deal are going to the right direction, or do you see that this can also hinder, in a way, the process towards a more sustainable society?
Thank you very much for this question, Elena. There's quite a lot to unpack there. I'll try to be concise. So I think the CSDD and the European Green Deal more broadly do mark a certain shift in the political economy of the Union, a shift that captures what has been discussed now as a post-neoliberal moment. And I see two dimensions of this post-neoliberal model. The first one is what I would call a market instrumentalism. So we see that the single market is less committed to only the protection of the competitive order and to markets in the abstract, just market building in the abstract, but instead it seeks to create and generate a specific kind of market. So a market that produces results that have been, to a certain extent, politically predetermined. So a push towards certain technologies, certain products, certain goods, and so on. So the goal becomes to embed public purpose within markets and steer them towards public objectives. And I think the CSDD fits very well within that kind of paradigm. And that also means within this question of market instrumentalism that public power through the Commission ceases to be, let's say, agnostic when it comes to the production of value. So it's not just market value produced through competition that matters, but public power acquires a say, a proactive stance, let's say, with regards to what should be produced, where we should be investing. So we see a shifting role of public power as such in this context of sustainability of the green transition. The second shift has to do with what I would call political capitalism. So that means that we see actually public power being not only there to secure the conditions for private accumulation, so for profitability, but being actively involved in the process of private accumulation. So this goes a little bit against this classic idea that public power is only there to protect the competitive order. Instead, we see through, for example, a good example is this strategy of de-risking that some panels, it was discussed in some panels yesterday as well when it comes to industrial policy. It's a primary strategy that is included in the Green Industrial Plan, which is the engine, let's say, of the European Green Deal. And the purpose is to crowd in private investment by de-risking private investors, bring them in, by de-risking private investment in more financially risky ventures, for example, in net zero technologies. And that means guaranteeing private profitability through, for example, subsidies, exceptions to state aid rules, or facilitated access to funding through guarantees and risk-sharing facilities, ultimately with the backing of the European Investment Bank Group. And I think these two theses, market instrumentalism and political capitalism, capture what is both promising but also problematic if we talk about real change, as your question suggests. On the one hand, what is promising is that we see that markets are being relegated from an end to a means. So the idea is not that we want to have markets as such and that's the end of the story, but markets are meant to deliver certain social objectives, certain political goals. And I think this opens up the question, what do we want markets for? What should we be deploying markets for? I think that opens up political space that is indeed promising. On the other hand, the kind of politicization that we see at the moment, for example, through de-risking when it comes to industrial policy, limits the scope of instrumentalism as to how we are instrumentalizing markets. And that means that markets are being instrumentalized only to the extent that private profitability remains intact. And that, I think, can be actually an obstacle for real change and real transformation, because there's not necessarily an overlap between profit calculations and the kind of transformations that are required for a genuine green transition.
Wonderful, thank you so much. When we speak about transition, especially sustainable transition, the focus is often on environmental sustainability. However, the aspect of social sustainability sometimes evades attention a little bit, as you, Kenneth, often point out. Now, the EU institutions are already working on something like a social taxonomy to add to the existing environmental taxonomy framework. In what ways? But there's actually many problems with this social taxonomy, not only because it's a highly politicized issue, but also because we so far lack adequate tools to measure and compare the social impacts of business and of policies. So in what ways do you think the policies like the CSDDD and other policies implementing the European Green Deal already impact on social sustainability, not only in the EU but also beyond? And do you think that given the risk of neo-colonial tendencies of a normatively strong EU, these impacts are to be welcomed or seen with criticism?
Oh, thank you very much for that question. The EU, as you know, has been very much focused on the environmental issues, say to the point that sustainability from the EU perspective or the global north means climate or biodiversity. There's nothing wrong with that, because if you look at it from the European perspective, some of the social issues have been taken care of. Say, for example, if you lose your job today, there is a safety net to capture you if you're unemployed. If you are sick, you have health insurance. If you're in the UK, for example, we have the National Health Service, which will admit you free of charge. So if you are out of school, then the state has a way of forcing you back to school. If they can't get you, they go for your parents. So you have institutionalized systems that help you to address the social problems. So I can understand why environmental problems are now taking the center stage. But if you go out of the EU or the global north, then the global south, you have problems. The social problems are still there. Health, education, poverty, unemployment. Think about unemployment, for example, in the African context. There is a report by the World Bank that says about 60% of African youths are unemployed. So if you put that in context, it changes the whole narrative about climate change. I'm not saying that climate change is not important by any measure, but what I'm saying in essence is that the Europeans have put climate at the center of their conversation about sustainability. Probably other parts of the world may need also to prioritize some of the other things that matter to them and put them at the center of the conversation. And the good thing about the sustainability conversation is that the different aspects of the SDGs are linked. So if you look at climate, you can through climate see unemployment, you can through climate see health implications of poverty. So if I put poverty there at the middle or unemployment, I can as well see climate action. So it's about framing and how it is presented to different societies. But what I like about the new CSDDD is the fact that it extends, it goes beyond the environmental conversation. And I'm happy that it's been passed into law. And so if we are thinking about sustainability along the value chain, it's not just about human rights. You talked about impact. And it's time to come back to the notion of externalities, going back to the market as well. Markets create externalities, and that's why we talk about market failure. So if you think about this as the regulation or governance of market failure, then it becomes very fundamental. But the question there is who should govern market failure? So at some point, it was left to the entrepreneurs, the businesses, through corporate social responsibility as a voluntary act, so through self-regulation to do that. But over time, they've not lived up to the expectation, and I guess that's why we now have hard regulation coming in to force companies to do some of these things. But the problem there is, to what extent is entrepreneurs and firms changing as a result of these regulations? We've seen a lot of them. How do we avoid the risk of this being a tick box exercise, more like a compliance thing, and nothing changes fundamentally? And that's usually the problem of capitalism, because it appears not to be changing, irrespective of how much we try to push it to become sustainable or responsible. But for that to happen, we need to come back to the view that sustainability is a mindset. Sustainability is a worldview. And if you have not understood it from that perspective, I'm sorry, all the other things will come and go, and the fundamental problems will still be there. But the question now is, to what extent are we training the new generation of entrepreneurs to understand their role in society? To what extent are we training the new managers and CEOs to understand that there is a purpose beyond just profit? Market is a means, and those in it should also understand it as a means. And market also has to serve society. Market doesn't need to destroy the environment. But then how do we create a market that is able to preserve the environment as we want it and also deliver value to society? I think that's the fundamental question, whether we have it within the European context or outside Europe. And every society then needs to engage with this question. And that's, again, why we talk about the varieties of capitalism. Capitalism is not the same across board. Capitalism in Europe, as we know, is different from capitalism in the US. And it's also different from capitalism in China. So the Global South also need to understand they need to domesticate their understanding of capitalism and markets to ensure that it works for them. So one of the challenges I see with this engagement with Brussels is what you have already known as the Brussels effect, where the Brussels standard becomes the gold standard that every country would like to adopt. And I see that as although it has its own positive trade-offs, but it can also imagine a situation whereby countries or different parts of the world try to copy something from Europe that was born out of European imagination, born out of European values, born out of European worldviews and sensibilities, to the context that wouldn't work for them. And you can also see how democracy is struggling in some parts of the world. So I think it holds its good bits. And when you talk about it in the context of social sustainability, this, I guess, also will provide that space to customize the idea and also, in a way, bring in the different impacts, whether positive or negative impacts that companies create. And this impact can only be contextual. Or context-based. So in that sense, I see it as a positive thing, but also we need to avoid the temptation of trying to homogenize the practice to the point that some parts of the world will be marginalized in that process.
Thank you, Kenneth. Caroline, I have a question for you. The policies that we have discussed in the last 15 minutes can be dubbed as example of stakeholder capitalism. Stakeholder capitalism rests on the conviction that economic law and policies, as well as the behavior of main market actors, should be centered on the interest of a wide range of stakeholders beyond the mere logic of financial profit. There is a controversial debate around the question of how wide the notion of stakeholder should be, and also about how can we implement concrete procedures that can actually establish a effective stakeholder capitalism. One way to do that is involving stakeholder and civil society in the design of business models and strategy, and the CSDDD includes some provisions in this respect. So given that you're an expert of stakeholder engagement with the public, in the public sector, but also to bridge the public sector with the private one, I would like to ask you, how do you imagine that we can structure these participatory processes of stakeholders within corporate governance?
Thank you, and also thank you for inviting me as a practitioner in societal decision-making, but also in power shifting, as I would say. And maybe I can build on what you've said, but also take our view into 3 directions to start with. I think, first of all, to answer your question, I would like to look outward and understand that everything that you've described is basically part of a mode that led to the poly-crisis that you described in the initial statement, and that basically requires us to take a planetary mindset, I think, and understand that it's not to be divided between social and environmental and economic, but there is a deep interconnectedness of us being part of a larger organism and basically treating this organism in a way that has led to the current status quo. Secondly, I would like to look inward, which means understanding that biodiversity and the basis of life on this planet that I just mentioned has to be part of the participation and is a stakeholder itself. It's not a prerequisite for an economy, but it is the baseline of the economy. And therefore, we need to understand that we don't only engage interculturally or, let's say, different groups, global north, global south. I think also the idea of the globe is a kind of abstraction. We use planetary as something where we are actually part of, and understand how can we enlarge our participatory processes, and also my practice with municipalities, with federal levels, within the European Green Deal, understanding how can we actually make space for stakeholders that don't have a human voice. And the third one is looking forward, which is meaning that within these processes, we are not only including people that are over there, But the question is, how are we including public administration to actually invigorate the system itself? How are we building transfer zones to implement the European Green Deal, but also this innovative directive into different levels so it touches the ground, and working with cities like Mannheim, like Berlin, but also across Europe, I can see that European directives and European strategies have a problem in being localized, because we don't have the capacity within the institutional system to actually land them and bring them to the SMEs or to the corporates, but also to local communities. I mean, we're talking not only about formal economies or formal markets, we're talking about community markets, we are talking about bridging production and consumption, we are talking about prosumerism, building smaller circles of building economies that are more circular, where the actual resources are happening. And also, therefore, the question is, how do we embed this in transformation alliances that are bridging around resources that we already see in Europe declining: drinking water, soil, energy. How are we actually setting up for something that is not looking into a growth model, but rather looking into a degrowth model? And I think this is my last point to make, that requires us to move from an extractive, let's say, hierarchical model of actually standing on the top of the creation, using technology to get as many resources out of the ground, into a more regenerative partnership model where we can actually understand how can our institutions be learning institutions? How can we build regulation, and also with this directive, guidelines that can be adapted to what is actually happening on the ground? Because what I see right now is, yes, we have ambitions, yes, we have legal text. The reality on the ground and the consequences are different ones.
Thank you, Caroline. That was brilliant.
Much for these wonderful replies so far. In order to have as much time as possible also for questions from our audience, we would like to pose just one last question to you. And let's say everyone has 1 minute precisely to reply. So, Elena, please go with your question.
We prepared 2 questions. Now I'm indecisive which one to pick. Since we have already talked a little bit about the changing relationship between the private and private realm, I would pick the second question, which is about the potential responsibility of companies in relation to the use and disposal of the products and service that they provide. I'm thinking about energy, but also social media and AI technologies. The CSDDD initially had envisaged a quite broader notion of supply chain that was described as value chain, and provided for liability of companies and due diligence obligations also in relation to the negative impacts of their products and services. Now, this term has been narrowed and restricted to downstream processes, but just until the distribution of products. But this is also a matter that opens many questions, and so that could be also controversial and difficult to reply. So I would like to know, what is your opinion about that, about the potential responsibility of companies for their products and services?
From here to there, 1 minute.
Should I start? Okay, great. Thank you for this question. I think that it's indeed a very important question. I'm sure that others can speak more in the substance. Perhaps Dan also give some more details. What I wanted to focus on is how perhaps framing the question in terms of responsibility of companies for goods or services sold in the market and so on might actually in a way, limit our institutional imaginations. There's like two risks, I think, here. The first is that we normalize the extension of the authority of private actors, which we empower to become essentially regulators of their global value chain through mechanisms of contractual governance or private ordering. And I think there is indeed a potential in human rights due diligence to reconstruct market relations along the global value chain. But at the same time, we should also be wary of treating corporate power as some sort of inevitable fact as opposed to a historical contingency. Corporate power is largely created by legal entitlements. It is public power that gives it its meaning and the potential for it to become, to have this regulating effect. And therefore, it's important to maintain, to think about also ways in which the state or public power directly can regulate global value chains as opposed to try to always harness private power within global networks of global production. The second thing which is associated with that is that thinking again through categories, even progressive categories that are being discussed now in the literature, like production liability, so liability not for defects of the product, but of the production process, might still not answer does not provide us necessarily with the tools of institutional imagination that recenter public power more broadly. And I think it's important to keep in mind that if the goal is to democratize the economy and expand public decision-making power, then it's important to think of tools about directly organizing production and directly sustainable production, as opposed to only penalizing companies a posteriori for engaging in unsustainable production.
Okay. Just building on that notion of democratization of the market and also seeing things from a different imagination, in addition to the work I do here, I serve as the Chief Economic Advisor to a subnational government in Nigeria, Imo State. And there we are trying a new way of looking at markets as well as the economic participants. Because sometimes when we think about the market and the corporate world, we only see the big beasts, right? The big companies. And in this part of Nigeria, you will struggle to find one or two companies that employ more than 250 people. So as part of one way to address that problem there of unemployment and market access is to think about communities owning businesses, community-owned enterprises. So we started talking about the One Kindred, One Business initiative, so that these people don't necessarily need to wait for the big corporate powers to provide jobs, but people can create jobs for themselves and localize some of these things. So the idea of the market there being something far from people is far-fetched in itself. So the One Kindred, One Business initiative by the Imo State government in Nigeria is a way of revolutionizing the problems around unemployment and encouraging communities to giving them that agency also to participate. But one thing also we are seeing is that corporates who are interested in this part of the world can use that as their form of corporate community development strategies, because some of these companies, through their typical CSR, they go there, they have one borehole there or hospital or a piece of road, but how are they also teaching the people how to fish as opposed to giving them fish? So this One Kindred, One Business initiative becomes a corporate community relation strategy that is more sustainable than the one that we see at the moment. So I think the point I'm making there is that the notion of the market needs to be seen from a different imagination. And I'll be doing some work on Afri-capitalism for those who may not be aware of it. And Afri-capitalism is a way of rethinking capitalism in a different context, as we know here.
Yeah, okay. I'll try to keep it short. The way I understand the question is really about a company's responsibility for the impact of its products or services. I agree, companies should be responsible for the impact of their products and services. It's true that in the CSDDD, the way the downstream value chain is defined in the final text is a bit narrower and different from what was in the initial proposal. I would still signal that there is a duty now as part of due diligence for companies to adapt, to improve their design and distribution practices. So that's also a lever through which they can influence the impact of their products through the design. But I would also say one other thing. CSDDD is a general legislation covering all the sectors. But there may be more specific legislations in relation to certain products, services, or in particular sectors, and the interplay is clarified in the very first article of that if there are more stringent requirements, more detailed requirements in other legislations, those would apply. So when it comes, for instance, you mentioned social media, artificial intelligence, there is also specific legislation on those. We have the Digital Services Act, we have the AI Act. There is now in the legislative process an AI liability directive. So just to say that CSDDD is indeed the broad general legislation, but it's not the whole. It's not the whole puzzle. It's an important part of the puzzle, but there is more to it.
I would say, listening to you, that yes, I agree, we have to democratize the economy, but we actually have to democratize the transformation of the economy. And looking at the kind of ripple effects, as I would say it in my language, so scope 3 implications, is to understand the interconnectedness, but also invest in education and capacity building to understand where we are in a human timescale. So understand the scale, understand the scope of what we have ahead of us. Yesterday was mentioned we need to invest billions, we need to restructure our economy massively, and the timescale that we have to actually do this. So I would say shifting from regulating objects or production means to regulating flows, understanding that it's interconnected, it's in us, everything that we put out there is actually coming back to us. Human rights are a subset of nature rights, and that means for me that we also have to incentivize economies and corporate entities to finish, to phase out, to exnovate, if they actually go through a kind of educative or learning process, understanding that what they're doing is not sustainable, it's actually harming the planet, it's harming us as humans. What can we offer them to stop the practice that they're already doing?
Thank you. Wonderful. We would now like to open up to questions from the audience, and I already see there's very many of them. In the spirit of time, please, in both asking and answering, be as precise as you can. Go.
Yeah, hi, thank you for the interesting talks and discussion. My name is Max from Europe Calling, and actually I'm joining you all in applauding this CSDDD for reining at least into some of the worst bits of exploitation. But one big sector is actually missing is the financial sector, and we still have European banks and insurers every year investing hundreds of millions of euros into fossil fuel industry, into exploitation via subsidiaries. So there's so much money still going there, and they are not covered by the 3 CSDDD. So what are we doing about this? We have 2.5 degrees on the horizon. We have crossed the 1.5 degrees. How can we have our banks and insurers just leave them investing into the, threatening the existence of this society, and really sitting there and saying, okay, so we have made a step, but I think the essential step of redirecting the money away from destroying this planet and crossing all the planetary boundaries we have, this is really what should be in the focus. So I would love to hear what you think about that. What can we do with the money?
Let's maybe bundle up a few questions. So let's keep going for a second.
Thank you. My name is Philippe Lambrecht. I'm teaching financial law at the University of Louvain. My question will be very brief, and thank you for all what you said. What do you think of the extraterritorial impact of CSDDD? Is that the new way of European capitalism? Are we going to a global capitalism, global and local? Thank you very much.
To me, it seems like these two questions are big enough to... Let's add one? Or
okay. No, we can have another round later. Maybe.
Okay.
No.
It's a specific reference to CSDDD. On the financial sector, you know, in the proposal, they were included. Now what we have is a review clause in 2 years' time, which is very soon. It's extremely soon. We should actually start working for it already. It's important, I would say, to have the incentives for the financial sector aligned with the incentives for the other sectors. What is now new with the adoption of the CSDDD is that the conversation changes in the sense that now we have the other sectors covered, and they will want also the financial sector to be aligned to them, because that will facilitate their access to funding that they need for this sustainability transition. So the context, I think, is shifting with the adoption of the CSDDD as it is now, and we will have soon a possible review. Concerning the extraterritoriality, we've had many discussions and questions about this. We are covering actually foreign companies that have significant business in our market, and that's perfectly legitimate. When it comes to what sustainability due diligence is, this is not something that is linked to a particular product. It is a corporate governance tool. So basically, these companies, we want them to also do sustainability due diligence, as our companies will do, subject to the same rules. But the thresholds are done in such a way that, you know, there is no excessive capturing of non-EU companies. Just for your information, we'll have something close to 6,000 EU companies within scope, and around 850, maybe a little more, non-EU companies. So this is the figures we're talking about.
Please.
Yes, thank you. Just a very brief reaction to these 2 points. I think they both capture excellent critiques of the CSDDD process right now. When it comes to finance, I do think that indeed this highlights the lack of disciplinary power when it comes to imagining current industrial policies. You know, we're thinking only in terms of carrots. We're not thinking really in terms of sticks. So I do think that instead of relying only on profitability to enlist private power to perform, you know, public objectives and so on, we should also retain mechanisms in which we can force private capital to align with public objectives, even if this may be at odds with private profit calculations. And this may be state-controlled finance, for example, or capital controls or other mechanisms along these lines. And when it comes to extraterritoriality, I agree that there is an element of, a problematic element there is that the ones who are supposedly beneficiaries of this regime are not really the authors of their own laws. So there is a problematic aspect of input legitimacy there.
To add to that. Okay. Oh, you go after you. No,
after you.
No, go.
I will zoom out a little bit.
Okay. I think going back to your point about the financial service sector, so if you think every bank or any financial institution is an organization first, so you think about the impact of that organization, which can be positive or negative, and banks can also look at their portfolios and the impacts they're having. But I think where I tend to disagree with you a bit, the idea, fossil fuel divestment, stop it all everywhere in the world. I think you're talking about planetary boundaries, and planetary boundaries means that we need to stay within the boundary, right? Not outside of it. And if you look at that, there's no way we can have a carbon-free world. I mean, it doesn't work. It's an imagination, right? So, but the point is that some part of the world has, produced more carbon than others. And then, if we want to remain in that boundary, then those that have produced more should produce less to allow others to produce as much as possible that would be within that boundary. But if we strip it all over, then some people will suffer as a result, and that's where the justice comes in. So, the just transition. So this whole idea that Africans, for example, shouldn't develop their fossil fuel or find
reasonable pathways, for me is bizarre. It's also part of the problem. And if you position it that way, then what legitimacy does Europe have to lecture Africans on how to use their fossil fuel? So you have the money, fine, but we also need to be just about the transition, because you see a lot of hypocrisy in the world. Look at what has happened between Ukraine and Russia and how Europe has moved to certain energy sources that you thought were unsustainable. Then what moral right do you have to lecture the rest of the world?
But I think this is where I can add, and also what you said refers to each other. It's like, for me, the question is, if we have a review, how do we actually design these type of processes and also have different stakeholders part of the actual making? And this was also my critique in terms of future of Europe, Fit for 55, Green New Deal. Yes, we have participatory processes for one thing, but the implementation rate is, what is it? You know, what have we implemented to what extent? Whereas now we have directives and societal decisions that will affect everyone, and where Europe can also play a new role and take on a new function if we actually have a different way of excluding or including people in the actual process of making directives, of bringing in all of the stakeholders that are necessary, and where we are basically carrying the risk as a society and not only as a corporate identity. And I think one last aspect of this, it's like, how can we train people in the process? So participation is not, I come there, I say something, and then it's going to be implemented, but how do we have participatory processes, for example, in the review, that include a kind of education of systemic interdependencies? Because what I see in the professional field, there are very few people understanding the interconnected risks, interconnected risk tipping points, and the consequences of these kind of implications and laws that will carry into the future nonetheless.
Thank you very much. Do we have other questions? Please.
So, Valerio Novembre, Schumann Center. Question for Dan. So I would fully agree that indeed, I mean, at the end, the CSDDD delivered something, and I think this is already very important. My question is more about the difference between the rule on the books, let's say, and the rules in action. Because when it comes to private enforcement, this was much reduced, and we know the story, but I wouldn't focus on that now, but more on public monitoring and public enforcement, let's say. And so indeed, the system that is currently in place delegates much to the national level, and there is very much unclarity about who is going to monitor day by day these rules, right? And there are gossips that, you know, in certain countries, there are very minimalistic approaches that are going to be taken, namely 3 or 4 people, you know, in some ministries delegated to monitoring thousands, maybe not thousands, but, you know, hundreds of firms, which are huge. So how do you see that? Because, of course, I mean, it's good to have a rule on the books, but whether that makes a difference in practice, you know, it's also up to day-by-day monitoring.
A question from over there, maybe?
Hello. My name is Ivan Romashenko. I'm a Max Weber Fellow at the Institute. So if we analyze European experience, we can see clear movement towards sustainability through Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and some court decisions in certain jurisdictions. But maybe my question is more related to the extraterritoriality. We can see in some other jurisdictions outside Europe, there is clear focus on profit generation, and maybe some companies, jurisdictions don't care at all about sustainability. So my question is about, can we somehow make it more attractive for those jurisdictions and companies, these clearly positive practices, or maybe to other ways to incentivize them? Thank you.
I'm afraid we have very little time, but let's take one last question from there.
Okay.
And,
thank you very much. Chiara Orlandini. I worked in European institutions for a long time. Now I'm advising in a private capacity certain governments. And going back to the partnership and the point of view of different countries, I think that this is a point that is very vague in all our discussions. But looking from the point of view out of Europe, of other countries, and thinking about the concept of sustainability that we have, there is a very different perspective. If I just take the exact example of what I'm doing at the moment, the idea of Argentina taking lithium off their countries in billions of tons from China, Canada, Russia, Australia, and now Europe, it's not sustainable for their country. They do not benefit at all from that. They take 3% of what is the value of the extracted material. Nothing is built in that country in order to build batteries out of it and promote a green transition or promote sustainable financial and economic growth in their country. The fact that they have resources that we need for our green transition, you know, should point Europe towards making long-term partnership, direct foreign investments, long-standing contract and commercial agreement, not going there educating them to what is our concept of sustainability, which is what I've been seeing for the past 3 years the European Commission doing, educating them towards our concept of sustainability. This is another very presumptuous, arrogant way of considering sustainability and finance.
Thank you for all the questions. I think now we can reply because we don't have a lot of time.
Try to keep it short. On enforcement, yes, we are aware capacities are not even among the different member states. There will be work on this. Among others, a European network of enforcement authorities for the CSDDD will be established to sort of try to ensure that the enforcement is as consistent as possible across the board. Not to forget, there's also private enforcement. So there's civil liability set up by this legislation. Now, on working with other jurisdictions and with other countries, indeed, so first, you know, Europe hasn't invented sustainability. There is, by the way, there is a process at the UN, mainly led from the Global South, about creating a legally binding instrument on business and human rights. So, you know, we will certainly support that process. The CSDDD is really about engaging more closely our companies in their value chains, including or in particular in countries outside the EU, so that they make the necessary investments to improve the situation there when it comes to human rights, including labor rights, including, by the way, we're talking living wage, living income, as well as the environment. So it's a recipe for closer engagement, and Europe doesn't have the monopoly of sustainability and will not be able to deliver sustainability by itself. It needs to be a joint undertaking.
But maybe to Caroline, we're really very sorry about all the questions that were still in the room. I'm sure we can all meet outside, but...
Like working with public institutions on a day-to-day level and coming back to how are European directives or laws or strategies implemented on a national but also municipal level is we see public institutions are struggling with monitoring, with following up all of these processes. And I think what will be the future is public commons partnership, public civic partnership, not only public-private partnership, to create a sensory network of actually understanding what's going on the ground. We have no other chance. And also taking in the kind of planetary perspective and understanding that our dependency and how we see developmental work has to change. And this is a possibility if we see this as an institutional innovation and if we come up with bureaucracy that actually enables people to partake in the implementation. If we hinder people to partake, then it scrutinizes, then we have to punish if people don't. But if we actually enable it and empower people with being part of something where Europe can also take a new role in the transition itself, I think it's a possibility. But it's really on the implementation side. How do we do that?
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This has been a brilliant panel.
Yeah, I think we don't have more time for other questions. So thanks everybody for being here. I hope that we have provided you with more ideas of the most recent development in public policy and European policies about corporate regulation and capital market regulation. I know that this could sound like a technical issue in a way, but considering also the wide political drama around this CS-DDD approval, on one side, as also Caroline was trying to stress, this is something that concerns all of us, and probably we will talk even more about these topics in the future. So thank you very much for being here today. And thanks to our speakers again.
Thank you.